To the holder of the forbidden book, a demonic voice offers the power to change the world. The price: dedicate his entire being and live with the demon at the end of the world. The young man, desperate, agrees, stating he'll do whatever it takes. He accepts his fate, even if it means going to hell with the devil. The story begins at the Grand Obai Academy of Magic. A student exclaims that the training dummies are no longer of any use. Another student laments that he just replaced them the other day. A teacher arrives on the scene, asking what happened. A student addresses her teacher, Rudon-sensei. She explains that the wooden dummies for swordsmanship practice are worn out again, even though they should last at least a year. She wonders aloud if someone is playing a prank on them. Rudon-sensei remains silent, contemplating the situation. The scene shifts to the vast library of the Obai Academy of Magic. A young man named Norman is deep in study. He reads about applications of taijutsu. He considers that if such techniques exist, there must be others as well. Rudon-sensei appears and addresses Norman directly. Norman is surprised to see his teacher. The teacher asks him how many hours he practices each morning to wear down the wooden dummies to such a state. Norman apologizes, explaining his dedication to training. He mentions that the semi-annual swordsmanship exam is today. Rudon acknowledges that Norman's hard work is a strength, but warns him that there's a limit to everything. He remarks that at this rate, Norman will end up reading all the books in the library. Norman quietly agrees. As he sits alone amongst towering stacks of books, Norman thinks to himself that he has already finished reading all of them. Later, at the Academy's outdoor training ground, the swordsmanship test is underway. Students are seen sparring with wooden swords. One student questions the need for swordsmanship at a magic school, but his friend reminds him it's for cultivating a healthy body and mind, and doesn't affect their grades. A particularly skilled student named Regal effortlessly defeats another opponent. He coldly tells his defeated classmate to go home. The defeated student looks on in shock. Onlookers are impressed, noting he's taken out 10 people already, and remarking that nobility is just different. Regal scoffs, asking if there are only weaklings here, as they are no match for him. He declares his hatred for people who cut corners in exams or competitions. He says it's a waste of time if they won't fight with the intent to kill. His intensity scares the other students into silence. Rudon-sensei asks if there is anyone else who wishes to challenge Regal. A bandaged hand rises. To the shock of the crowd, Rudon-sensei announces the next challenger is Norman. The other students begin to murmur, identifying the quiet transfer student as the heir to the prestigious Estland noble family. The students anticipate a match between nobles, with most betting on Regal. One student is confident, telling his friend to just watch and see. Regal marks Norman's unusually short wooden sword, questioning if it's a joke. Norman calmly replies that he's very serious. Rudon-sensei signals for the match to begin. Norman immediately goes on the offensive. He knows that the standard-issue wooden swords, while seemingly fair, are a disadvantage for those whose physiques they don't suit. By modifying his weapon, he gains an edge. He turns the disadvantage of an ill-fitting weapon into his favor. The onlookers are amazed by his unexpected movements. With fluid and unpredictable strikes, Norman presses his attack. Regal struggles to parry the blows. The students can't believe their eyes as Regal, the overwhelming favorite, is forced onto the defensive. Regal grits his teeth in frustration. Enraged, Regal shouts at Norman to stop messing around. Norman easily blocks Regal's attack. Regal calls his opponent's style nimble and cunning. He accuses him of fighting like a thief or an assassin and abandoning his pride as a noble. Norman explains that he could never beat Regal with the swordsmanship taught in class, revealing a second, shorter blade. Regal is shocked to see the second weapon. Norman declares that his best solution is to fight with knowledge and effort, not pride or talent. A student questions if modifying weapons is cheating. Rudon-sensei clarifies that it's not against the rules and is, in fact, a noble ancient swordsmanship style from a neighboring country. He explains that the true purpose of swordsmanship classes is to cultivate a healthy body and mind by learning to think and act for oneself. He advises that one should not blindly accept the given environment or rules. Instead, one must always think about what is best for them. A flashback reveals Norman's thought process during his training. He had remembered his teacher's words while studying. He approached Rudon-sensei, asking if it was okay to modify the provided wooden sword to make it easier to use. Rudon had confirmed that while the rule is to use the provided wooden sword, the possibility of modifying it is not explicitly forbidden. Rudon-sensei had praised Norman for noticing the loophole in the rules. With this confirmation, Norman realized he had a path to victory. He believed that he could win. He dedicated himself to crafting his own weapons. He studied diligently to perfect his technique. After all his effort, he finally arrived at this moment. Back in the fight, Norman's movements are small, quick, and precise. Regal, accustomed to overpowering his opponents, finds himself unable to push through with force. In a swift move, Norman breaks Regal's sword. Norman tells Regal that no matter how physically fit or talented someone is, if they let their guard down, they will surely be tripped up. He finishes by saying they can be defeated by someone like him. Regal grits his teeth, realizing the truth in his opponent's words. Regal realizes Norman's technique, a straight thrust without using force, but concentrating all of his weight into a single point. The focused impact shatters Regal's wooden sword completely. Regal is left in shock. As Regal's broken sword falls, the other students look on in disbelief. Norman holds the tip of his weapon to Regal's throat and declares his victory, acknowledging that his endless reading and training were not for nothing. Humiliated and furious, Regal glares at Norman. He snarls, telling him not to get cocky. A dark energy begins to swirl around him. Regal unleashes a powerful blast of magic. Norman is caught completely off guard. The magic strikes him directly. He is sent flying backward across the training ground. Regal sneers, telling Norman not to think a failure like him can stand on the same level. He then summons a massive creature made of dark flames, a flaming lion. Regal commands his flaming lion to attack. Norman raises his bandaged hand. He instinctively attempts to cast a simple fireball spell in defense. He assumes the casting stance, his hands held ready. But nothing happens. He looks at his hands in confusion. He shouts the incantation again and again. His magic fails to manifest. The flaming lion closes in. He can only look on in despair, wondering why his magic won't work. Just as the flaming lion is about to strike, a powerful spell, Ice Prison, is cast. The fiery beast is encased in a massive block of ice. Rudon-sensei steps between the two students, his expression stern. He looks down at the shattered ice and declares that this is enough. He reminds Regal that this is a swordsmanship test, and the use of magic is not permitted. He tells Regal to cool his head. As Regal walks away, he calls Norman a shame. He sneers that no amount of technique or knowledge matters if you can't use magic. He tells Norman to get lost, calling him an eyesore. The other students begin to whisper, wondering why Norman, a noble, didn't use magic. Another explains that it's not that he didn't, but that he can't. He's one of the rare, talentless people who are completely unable to use magic, rendering his swordsmanship and knowledge useless. Another student adds that this is why he's called. Defeated and humiliated, Norman stands alone, branded by his peers as the incompetent Norman. He hangs his head in shame, a trickle of blood on his lip. Returning to his home, the Esland family estate. He descends a winding stone staircase. He enters the family's vast underground library. Slumped over a desk, Norman despairs over his constant practice. He knows that the foundation of magic is to call upon spirits and borrow their power, but he has never heard a spirit's voice in 14 years. He wonders why. Suddenly, a strange presence seems to reach for him. He is startled by a sudden noise. A dark aura draws his attention to a single black book on the shelf. He pulls it out. It is titled Ars Gosha. He realizes with a shock that it must be a forbidden technique for demon summoning. As he holds the book, he hears a voice like a moan or a scream. His sister Nene suddenly enters the library, calling for him. Startled, Norman turns around. She immediately notices his injuries and scolds him for not even saying he was home. Nene begins to use healing magic on his face. She lectures him about his relentless schedule of training and studying. She tells him to take better care of himself. He replies that since he can't use magic, he has to work several times harder than others. Nene listens with a concerned expression. Nene reassures him, telling him she knows how hard he works and that his efforts will be worth it. She encourages him to be confident in himself and what he's accomplished. She reminds him of their promise. He will inherit and protect the family, and she will become a great magician to support him. She smiles, asking if he remembers their promise to their mom. Norman apologizes for bothering her, but Nene insists it's fine. He smiles gently and thanks her for everything. Nene looks away, flustered. She affectionately calls him a stupid older brother as she finishes healing him. A maid arrives to summon Norman and Nene. She informs them that their father, Mark Sama, has summoned them. They enter their father's study. Marx begins to speak to Norman. He states that he has decided to not expect anything from him anymore. Their father coldly announces that he is banishing Norman from the Estland family. He calls it unheard of for someone of their lineage to be unable to use magic at nearly 15 years old. Marx declares his utter disappointment in his only heir and states that he will adopt a son to replace him. Nene protests, arguing that he knows how hard her brother works every day. Her father dismisses Norman's efforts, calling him a disappointment for being unable to use even basic magic. Marx calls for the new heir, Dmitri, to enter. Dmitri smirks, thanking his new father for the introduction. He patronizingly tells Norman it's unbelievable he can't use magic when both his parents were excellent magicians, calling him a disgrace. He places a hand on Norman's shoulder and says not to worry anymore. Dmitri smugly declares that he will protect the house now. Nene furiously shouts that he isn't her family and tells him to get out. Dmitri swiftly backhands her across the face. Nene falls to the ground. Dmitri asserts his dominance, stating that while he may be a commoner, he is a genius at magic. He declares himself the next head of the household and warns her that he will show no mercy if she defies him. Norman can only call out his sister's name in shock as she tries to stand up. Marx informs Nene that he has decided to marry her off to another noble house as soon as she turns 15. Nene reacts in shock and anger. Dmitri adds that he and his father decided it was for the sake of making beneficial connections for the family. Marx coldly demands that she be obedient. Nene is left speechless. Marx tells Norman to leave by morning, as a place has been prepared for him. With the conversation declared over, he dismisses them both from his sight. As they leave the study, Nene whispers that the situation is ridiculous. With tears in her eyes, she laments their broken promise to their mother. She runs off down the hall, leaving Norman behind. Norman is crushed, realizing it was all for nothing. His house and family were lost to him. He reflects on his endless training, feeling that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't achieve anything. He clutches his head in despair, wondering what he should have done. Then a thought strikes him, an idea, a last resort. He remembers the book from the underground library. He runs back towards it. He finds the Ars Gotia again. He recalls the voice he heard, a voice not of a person, something he could hear even when he couldn't hear spirits. He realizes it wasn't a spirit's voice. This book is a grimoire for summoning demons. This is definitely it. He's certain now it was the voice of a demon. He knows the risks of dabbling in forbidden arts, but his life is no longer guaranteed anyway. He decides that if this is a way to escape his situation, he must take it and runs with the book. In the center of the library, Norman prepares the ritual, drawing a summoning circle on the floor. He reads from the grimoire. He begins to chant the incantation. He calls out to one who has arisen from the brink of oblivion. He continues the chant, calling for the entity to answer his wish and emerge from the endless beyond. He asks it to reveal itself to him. He describes how the winds howl and the seas swirl. He speaks of raging flames dying down and the earth shaking and rumbling. With newfound power in his voice, he commands the one who is praised by the universe and rules over everything to come forth. He calls out the name, Furka's 50th in the order of the Gotia. The summoning circle on the floor begins to sparkle. Norman watches in anticipation. It glows with an intense, brilliant light. Norman shields his eyes, groaning from the sudden surge of power. As the light fades, a figure emerges from a cloud of smoke and asks if it was Norman who summoned him. Norman looks on in shock as the demon introduces himself as one of the 72 demons of Solomon. He reveals his name, Furkas, and his rank as 50th. Furkas asks Norman what his wish is. Norman is at a loss for words. The demon presents him with visions of common desires, women, money, power, and wisdom. He even offers the possibility of immortality. He asks again, what does Norman wish for? The ancient demon stares intently at the boy who possesses the power of the Ars Gotia. Before Norman stands the entity he has called forth, a demon. The reality of his success washes over him. He truly has summoned a demon. The demon Furkers asks the boy for his wish. After a moment of hesitation, Norman declares his one desire, to be able to use magic. Furkers considers the request. Norman is stunned, asking why. Furkers immediately tells him that's impossible. The demon explains that he is hated by the spirits. To use magic, one must borrow the power of spirits, and they would never lend their power to someone they hate. The reason for the spirits' hatred, Furkers reveals, is that Norman is favored by demons. His strong, pure soul is an irresistible target for corruption. However, this very quality gives him access to other powers, and with them, achieving something like magic might not be impossible. Norman listens, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Just as Norman presses for more information, Furkers cuts the conversation short, insisting they continue tomorrow. The demon states it's past the boy's bedtime. The scene shifts abruptly to the next morning, leaving Norman bewildered. Outside the Esland estate, Norman, suitcase in hand, asks Furkers for his name. The demon, accompanied by a horse, questions the luggage for a simple stroll. Worried about being discovered, Norman begs Furkers to be quiet, but the demon reassures him that for now, only Norman can see or hear him. Furkers explains that demons are initially summoned in a spirit form, and he can't physically interact with the world. Norman clarifies that this isn't a stroll. His family declared that those who cannot use magic have no right to be in their house. He admits that he has been banished. He explains that his banishment is why he turned to the Ars Gotia. Furkers asks why he was the first of the 72 pillars to be summoned. Norman admits it was by chance. He simply opened the book to Furkers' page. The demon considers this good luck, warning that summoning a more vicious demon would have led to regret. Furkers gravely tells him he could have died. Not all demons will obey him, and he must be prepared to stop them with his own power if they act against his will. The weight of his actions hits Norman. In his desperation, he was naive to the dangers and could have endangered Nene and others. Norman thanks Furkers for the advice and promises to be more careful. As they walk, he looks out over the town. He wonders about the place his father had prepared for him. They arrive at a dilapidated, overgrown house, as Norman wonders if he can truly live there. Furkers phases through the door, confirming the interior is also a mess. The demon notes that its unpopularity will make it a convenient base. Inside, Norman gets ready to resume their conversation from the previous night. Furkers begins his explanation. He describes the various types of magic in the world. He clarifies that the most common form is natural magic. Because Norman is favored by demons, he is hated by the spirits, making it impossible for him to use this type of magic. However, Norman can use a different kind, demonic magic, for which he has a natural talent. Furkers explains that to perform acts similar to natural magic, Norman must borrow the power of demons who can manipulate elements like fire and water. Norman understands this as a form of pseudo-natural magic. Furkers confirms this but reiterates that to borrow these powers, he must summon various demons. This is an act that always comes with a high level of risk. Suddenly, Furkers materializes his spear. He presses it against Norman's throat, asking if he truly desires magic that much. Norman is momentarily speechless. Norman explains his promise to his late mother to protect his family. Because of his incompetence, a stranger has taken his place and his sister is suffering. This new path using a demon's power is the only thing keeping him alive. He grabs the spear, declaring that if Furkers refuses, he will kill himself before any demon can take his soul. The demon remarks that by threatening suicide, he'll never obtain the strong and pure soul that demons desire. He begs Furkers to lend him his power. He looks down at the boy, asking if he is trying to threaten a demon. The spear dematerializes and the farce is over. Furkers apologizes, explaining he was testing Norman's determination. Relieved, Norman collapses, admitting he thought he was going to die. Furkers then warns him to be careful. While most demons need permission to materialize, some, like himself, can do so at will. To control such demons, Furkers explains that Norman must first learn a binding spell. This power resides within the Ars Gotia itself and will allow him to seal a demon's movements. He'll need a practice partner, but when Norman suggests Furkers himself, the demon declines. Furkers claims to be too old and frail for practice, insisting Norman summon another. Furkers points to a page in the grimoire for Orobas, the 55th ranked demon. He notes that Orobas is loyal and will surely help. As Norman prepares to summon him, Furkers stops him. He explains that Norman cannot yet summon two demons at once and must first send Furkers back to the demon world. Summoning demons requires immense mental strength, and keeping even one in this world consumes a great deal of energy. Reckless summoning could lead to possession. Furkers reassures Norman that with practice, his mental strength will grow, and eventually he'll be able to summon multiple demons. He tells Norman to simply summon him again if he needs anything. The boy thanks him. In the name of the summoner, Norman formally orders Furkers to return to his world until he is summoned again. As he begins to fade, Furkers offers one last piece of advice. There are 2 demons he should avoid summoning if possible. These demons are Bua, rank 13th, and Asmodeus, rank 32nd. Furkers warns that those 2 are not only powerful but also cunning and rebellious. Summoning them carelessly would surely lead to the corruption of his soul. Despite the warning, Furkers admits he'd like to see Norman use all the demons. With a final word of encouragement, he fades away, leaving Norman to ponder his future. Norman finds it strange that a demon would have expectations of him when his own father did not. His only path to using magic is by borrowing the power of demons. He will first master the binding spell, then summon others to learn pseudo-magic. If he can prove he is a better magician than Dimitri, then everything will go back to the way it used to be. With his goal firmly in mind, Norman opens the Ars Gotia once more. He begins the incantation, his voice echoing in the empty house as he calls upon the 55th demon, Orobas, to emerge from the endless beyond and answer his wish. A horse-headed demon appears before him, looming over him and asking if he is its master. Startled, Norman can only stammer that while he doesn't know about being a master, he is the one who summoned him. The demon, Orobas, is deeply impressed by Norman's respectful manner. He eagerly offers his services, from cooking and laundry to cleaning Norman's body with his long tongue, much to the boy's horror. When Norman addresses him as Orobas-san, the demon bursts into tears, moved by the honorific. Norman, finding the situation tiresome, insists that Orobas drop the formalities. The demon is moved to tears once again, overjoyed that his master has granted his wish. Orobas eagerly asks for his orders. Norman, thinking that Furkers wasn't exaggerating about his loyalty, explains that he wants Orobas to be his practice partner for learning the binding spell. The demon is thrilled by the prospect of being restrained, asking for it to be tight and intense. Before they begin, Orobas notes that a binding spell is typically used on a materialized demon trying to interfere with the world. He therefore suggests he should materialize for the practice, when Norman agrees. Orobas is once again overcome with emotion, declaring Norman the most magnanimous person in the world. He begins sobbing about his kindness, apologizing for being a crybaby. Orobas suggests they begin practicing the binding spell. To add tension and make the practice more effective, he proposes that Norman should strike him with a short whip every time he fails to restrain him. The demon eagerly encourages Norman to hit him, much to the boy's confusion. Norman refuses, stating he can't hit his master. Norman questions Orobas' new appearance. Orobas explains that he's materialized into a humanoid form to avoid drawing unwanted attention from other humans. The demon begins to dance, suggesting it will make it easier for Norman to see when the binding is successful. Hesitantly, Norman agrees and begins the incantation, solemnly commanding Orobas. Reading from the grimoire, Norman casts the binding spell, forbidding all of Orobas' actions in his name. The spell hits its mark, and the demon cries out as magical energy envelops his neck. For a moment, Norman is relieved, believing he has succeeded. Orobas is deeply impressed, praising Norman for casting such a spell on his first try. However, Norman can tell it's not good enough. He asks Orobas not to spoil him, and to be honest if he's doing something wrong, stating that true kindness would be to point out his flaws. Moved by his master's spirit, Orobas is brought to tears. The demon agrees to help for Norman's sake. Taking him seriously now, Orobas easily shatters the binding spell. Orobas then readies himself, promising to take his master seriously from now on. After numerous failed attempts, Norman collapses in frustration, wondering why he can't bind the demon. He realizes that while he can restrain Orobas, the spell isn't powerful enough and that something is missing. Just as Orobas suggests a break, a distant bell rings, and Norman remembers he has to go to school. Orobas asks if Norman is going to school, and the boy confirms that despite being kicked out of his house, he's still allowed to attend until he graduates. Worried about the broken lock on the door, Norman asks Orobas to watch the house while he's gone. After Norman leaves, Orobas considers cleaning until his master returns. Arriving late to the grand school building, Norman decides to skip the noisy classroom and head to the library. He hopes to find a book that might give him a hint for his practice. He searches the shelves for books on binding spells and restraint. He looks for a method of restraint that is less physical and more absolute. As he reads, Norman recalls a key part of a lesson: what truly matters is the image. The teacher explained that the foundation of magic is communication with spirits. The more clearly one can visualize the spirit's movements, the easier they are to control. A realization dawns on Norman: what if the binding spell is meant to stop the movement of magic itself, not the physical body? Excited by this new idea, he plans to test it as soon as he gets home. As he's leaving the library, he's stopped by his teacher, Rudon-sensei. The teacher tells him to hurry to a briefing for the next magic competition in classroom 3. In the classroom, Rudon-sensei announces the details of the magic tournament, explaining that the winner will receive a recommendation to the prestigious Xenos Academy of Higher Magic. The Xenos Academy is an elite school that only a handful of geniuses can enter. Rudon-sensei warns the students that injuries from magical combat are common and that they should not participate with a half-hearted attitude. He then calls for volunteers for the qualifiers, from which the top 8 will advance to the main tournament. A student named Regal Randalls raises his hand to participate. Several other students also volunteer. Rudon-sensei notes that the number of participants is about the same as in previous years and asks if there is anyone else. Just then, a single bandaged hand rises from the crowd. Norman announces his name, volunteering for the tournament. His classmates are shocked, whispering about how someone who can't use magic could possibly participate. But for Norman, this is his chance to prove he is a better magician than Dimitri. Rudon-sensei questions Norman, asking if he will be able to use magic by the time the qualifiers begin. Norman confidently declares that he will be able to use magic by the qualifying round. The teacher accepts his answer. Regal Randall scoffs, remarking that it would be a sight to see. Regal turns to Norman with a sneer, telling him he'd better not turn out to be an incompetent liar. Norman meets his gaze undeterred. With only a month left until the magic tournament, Norman contemplates the challenge ahead. His first-round opponent is Art Molden, a talented student skilled in both magic and swordsmanship. To have a fighting chance, Norman decides he must learn fire magic before their match. He returns home, greeted by his familiar, knowing that mastering the binding spell is the crucial first step. Recalling Rudon-sensei's lesson, Norman realizes his initial understanding of the binding spell was wrong. Orobas encourages his master, ready for the attempt. Norman understands he must imagine how Orobas moves and thinks, targeting the flow of magic itself. He focuses on every detail of the demon's being, his breath, his gaze, and the very circulation of his power. Norman casts the binding spell, commanding the 55th ranked demon Orobas to obey and cease all actions. The spell takes hold, and Orobas feels the magical chains constricting him. Despite his confidence, the demon finds this attempt far more powerful than the last. Norman senses it's still not enough and pours more energy into the spell, making it deeper and heavier. He focuses his will, commanding the very flow of magic to stop. The grimoire glows with intense power as the binding spell fully manifests. Chains of pure magical energy wrap around Orobas, completely immobilizing him in a glowing prison. Stunned by his success, Norman wonders aloud if he actually did it. He calls out to the completely still Orobas, receiving no response. Realizing the demon can't even speak, Norman apologizes and decides to release him. He begins the incantation to remove the binding. Suddenly, Orobas grabs his hand, stopping him. Once freed, an ecstatic Orobas praises Norman, exclaiming that he couldn't move at all. Norman is relieved, thanking Orobas for helping him achieve his first goal. Orobas, moved, is glad he could be of service to his master. With the task complete, Norman prepares to use an eviction spell, much to Orobas' shock. Orobas frantically begs his master not to make him leave. Norman explains that he needs focus to teach him magic, but Orobas insists he doesn't need to be evicted, pointing out that Norman can now summon 2 demons simultaneously. Seeing Norman's confusion, Orobas offers to answer his questions in Focus' place. He then asks what kind of magic his master wants to be able to use. Norman declares his intention to learn fire magic within the next month for his exam. Orobas suggests summoning Aim, the 23rd ranked demon, as the best candidate. He warns Norman that Aim is very aggressive and that he must be careful, promising to protect him if needed. Norman understands and agrees to the conditions. Norman begins the summoning ritual, reciting a powerful incantation from the grimoire. From the magic circle emerges Aim, the 23rd ranked demon, who disdainfully asks if the little punk summoned him. Aim reveals its full terrifying form, a chimera with a humanoid torso, a snake, and a three-eyed cat. Norman is frozen in shock, unable to speak. Realizing the cat head is the main body, Norman stammers a confirmation as it threatens to burn him. Enraged, Aim threatens to burn Norman to a crisp for daring to try and use him. Orobas leaps to his master's defense, but Aim dismisses him as a pervert, much to Norman's private observation. Aim is impressed that Norman can summon two demons at once, conceding he might be more than just a brat. Norman explains that he needs demonic power to use magic, and asks to be taught fire magic. Aim's humanoid head notes that demons are drawn to his power, and asks if Norman is sure he wants help. The demon seems to agree, suggesting he has no choice but to lend his power. But Aim's compliance was a ruse. With a cruel sneer, the demon asks if Norman really thought it would be that easy. Before Norman can react, Orobas shoves him out of the way of a sudden attack. A massive column of demonic fire erupts where Norman was just standing, demonstrating Aim's immense and destructive power. Orobas stands protectively in front of Norman, shielding him from the blast. He angrily questions how Aim dared to attack his master. Norman stares in wide-eyed horror, barely able to comprehend the destructive force he has just witnessed. The terrifying realization dawns on him. He had been trying to command the power of a true monster. Norman trembles, terrified by the overwhelming power of the newly summoned demon, Aim. He questions if he is even capable of wielding such a creature. As doubt consumes him, Orobas' urgent voice cuts through his fear, calling out to his master. Orobas yells at Norman not to be afraid, and to cast the binding spell immediately. But Aim, unimpressed, tells Orobas to get out of the way, its gaze fixed on the boy. A massive explosion rocks the area, sending shockwaves outward. The blast startles three maids in a nearby building, who wonder if it was an earthquake. Orobas has shielded him from the blast, and gently asks if his master is hurt. Norman marvels that Orobas used himself as a shield, quickly assuring him that he's fine and asking about his familiar's condition. Aim calls Orobas crazy for protecting a human to such an extent. Orobas retorts that only the human race truly needs demons. He passionately declares that as long as his master needs him, he will serve with loyalty. For Orobas, that loyalty is his very reason for existence. Aim concedes that they will never understand each other. The demon threatens to burn both Orobas and Norman to ashes. But Orobas stands firm, reassuring his master that he has nothing to fear, vowing to protect him at any cost. He urges Norman to do what he must. Frustrated with always being protected, Norman resolves that he is no longer the helpless person he used to be. He focuses his will, casting a binding spell and solemnly commanding Aim. The demon is shocked as the spell takes hold. Knowing he must act to be worthy of Orobas' loyalty, Norman forbids all of Aim's actions in his name. Chains of pure magical energy erupt and wrap around Aim, completely restricting the demon's movements. Bound by the spell, Aim grudgingly congratulates Norman on his success. Norman approaches, telling Aim that they cannot talk like this. Orobas watches with concern as his master prepares his next move. Norman prepares to remove the binding spell. Once freed, Aim is bewildered by Norman's actions. The demon questions if Norman is stupid or has some ulterior motive. Norman states his intention plainly. He wants to talk to Aim as an equal. The demon can only let out a short, incredulous laugh. Aim declares it has been a long time since it was mocked to this extent, so infuriated it can't even laugh. Norman calmly offers to build a friendly relationship. While one of Aim's heads flatly refuses, Orobas is shocked at the turn of events. Aim's cat head redefines an equal relationship as a transaction. Norman makes a startling proposal. He will teach Aim magic, and in return, Aim must exterminate humans and cities until Norman is satisfied. Aim admits it cannot do that. Norman realizes he'll get no magic if the demon refuses. He amends his offer, suggesting that if he becomes a magician, he may end up in a war. He proposes that this future conflict might fulfill Aim's wish for destruction. The demon scoffs that he's just a kid who needs to learn negotiation. Aim asks why Norman is so desperate to use magic, warning that it's a life-risking endeavor. Norman reveals that Furkers asked a similar question. Norman explains he told Furkers that if he didn't help, he would kill himself, losing his soul. Aim bursts into laughter, delighted by the boy's audacity in threatening the old man. Impressed, Aim declares it likes Norman's guts and agrees to teach him fire magic as a special favor. Orobas is thrilled for his master, even as Aim clarifies they are not friends. Aim explains that since Norman can't use natural magic, he must absorb Aim's power into his body. Norman admits he can't channel demons, so Orobas offers to lend his own power directly. Aim instructs Norman to imagine taking a tiny fraction of its power, warning that any more would result in possession. Steeling himself, Norman prepares to begin. He places his hand on Aim's snake form and begins the process, wincing as the power flows into him. As Norman struggles with the influx of power, Orobas cries out in concern. Aim calmly tells him to watch, confident that Norman can handle it. Norman feels his blood boiling from the intense energy. He forces himself to stay calm and concentrate the power into a single point as instructed. As he does, Aim senses that he's succeeding. Orobas tells him to look at the back of his left hand. A sigil has appeared on his bandages, which Aim identifies as its own. Aim explains that with this sigil, Norman can now use pseudo-fire magic. Orobas congratulates his master on this achievement. Norman looks at his hand in awe, realizing he can finally use magic. The scene shifts to the Orbai Academy of Magic's outdoor arena, packed with spectators. A proctor announces the beginning of the selection exam for the magic tournament. The first match is announced, Norman Esland versus Art Maudlin. The proctor explains the rules and begins the fight. Art condescendingly apologizes for not holding back against someone who can't use magic. He vows to finish the match quickly. As Art prepares his attack, Norman remains calm, raising his bandaged hand. With the sigil glowing, he confidently chants the incantation for a fireball. Norman unleashes a swirling ball of dark fire, chanting the incantation for a fireball. His opponent, Art, can only stare in disbelief. Recovering from his shock, Art conjures a water blade to counter. The two spells collide in a massive explosion of steam and energy. Art stares through the smoke, utterly baffled that Eslan could use magic. Norman stands firm amidst the dissipating smoke, his bandaged hand still raised from casting the spell. The crowd murmurs in confusion. One student expresses his disbelief at what he's seeing. Even Rudan-sensei looks on with intense curiosity, wondering when Norman learned to use magic. Art smirks, declaring that he can now fight without holding back. He unleashes a powerful fire bomb spell. Norman quickly counters with another fireball of his own. He manages to deflect the attack just in time, believing it was a direct hit. Art casts a wind gust to clear the smoke from the arena. He frantically searches for his opponent in the now empty space. Suddenly Norman appears behind him, a flaming dagger in hand. Art whirls around, demanding to know where the weapon came from, calling him an assassin. In the crowd, students question why Norman would use a dagger against magic. One student explains that they have spent years studying and practicing to master magic. He reasons that it's impossible for Norman, who has only been able to use magic for a few weeks at most, to match their skill. He concludes that even with superior swordsmanship, Norman can't defeat Art, because magic is the ultimate power in their world. Norman relentlessly attacks with another fireball. Art easily deflects it with a gust of wind. Norman keeps his distance, launching another attack that misses its mark. Art taunts him, confident that such a simple spell won't connect. The crowd begins to notice a pattern, wondering if Ignition and Fireball are the only spells Norman is capable of using. Norman's thoughts confirm the crowd's suspicion. In a flashback, he remembers asking Orobas if he could truly use magic with the demon's sigil. Orobas had warned him that his control was poor, and that after a month of practice, a simple fireball was all he could manage. Attempting a bigger move would cause him to self-destruct. Recalling this, Norman knew he didn't have a solid plan, only a desperate gamble. Even so, he was determined to see it through. His strategy was to distract his opponent with decoy attacks. He would throw Art off guard with his limited spells. Then he would use the smoke from Art's own counterspells to cloud his vision. And then he would make his move. With Art's vision clouded, Norman charges forward with everything he has. He slams into his opponent with a full-body tackle. Art is completely caught off guard by the physical attack. As Norman pushes him back, Art scoffs that this isn't magic or even swordsmanship. He questions if Norman has reached his wit's end and is simply giving up. Art digs his heel into the stone floor, cracking the tiles as he tries to stop their momentum. The crowd watches in stunned silence. Rudon-sensei and the other students are shocked by the sudden development. Art looks down, realizing his mistake with a serious expression. The proctor's voice rings out, declaring Art Molden out of bounds. The proctor announces the winner of the match is Norman Esland. Art realizes that Norman had been using the smoke and irregular movements to attack the flooring all along. He understands that Norman's goal was to push him out of bounds from the very start. Furious at being outsmarted, Art yells at Norman not to screw with him. The crowd erupts in protest, calling Norman a coward and demanding a fair fight. Ignoring them, Norman turns to his opponent. He simply says, "Thank you, Art." Art is stunned by the earnest gratitude. He can only watch as Norman turns and walks away from the arena. Norman reflects that he can't be happy about a victory won with a demon's forbidden power. He tries to push the thoughts aside, knowing he must focus on his next match. Suddenly, he is stopped in his tracks. It is Rudon-sensei. The teacher tells him that his fight with Art was great. Rudon-sensei says he's sure Norman put in more effort than anyone could imagine. Placing a hand on Norman's head, he tells him he's done a great job. He advises the boy to be less hard on himself and to give himself a pat on the back once in a while. With that, the teacher turns and walks away. Overwhelmed by the unexpected praise and kindness, Norman is brought to tears. He watches his teacher depart, wiping his eyes with his bandaged hand. Norman reflects on his recent victory against Art, realizing the next round is his ticket to the country's magic tournament. He watches his next opponent, Regal, effortlessly deflect a combination of fire and wind magic. Regal's current challenger despairs as his attacks prove completely ineffective. With a look of utter disdain, Regal asks if this is the best his opponent can do. Regal scoffs at his opponent's half-hearted determination and unleashes a devastating spell, a massive firestorm that engulfs the arena. The crowd roars as the powerful magic tears through the stadium. Norman is stunned, recognizing the attack as a level 15 upper-class compound magic. The announcer declares Regal Randalls the winner of the match. As the medical team rushes in, Norman stands frozen, overwhelmed by his opponent's power. Regal stands alone in the ruined arena, a figure of immense power, while Norman admits to himself he can't imagine a way to win. Medical staff carry the defeated Mage away on a stretcher. Regal looks on with cold indifference. Norman watches the scene unfold, his expression a mixture of shock and apprehension. Back at his residence, Norman concludes that he can't compete with Regal at his current level. Fortunately, the destruction of the arena has bought him some time, while repairs are underway. He decides to use this time to learn water magic, hoping it will give him an edge. Norman asks the summoned demon Furkers to tell him about demons who are good with water magic. He gets no response, as Furkers appears to be asleep. Orobas frantically tries to wake him, pointing out that it is not bedtime yet. Furkers groggily awakens, surprised to see them and admitting he'd only meant to take a short nap. Furkers suggests summoning Krosel, the 49th demon, who is skilled in water magic but known to be a troublemaker. He asks why Norman didn't just ask Orobas, who sheepishly admits he doesn't interact with other demons. Norman recalls his difficult encounter with the demon Aim, and Furkers is impressed he managed to tame such a ruffian. Norman credits Orobas for helping him negotiate, which moves the demon to tears. His business concluded, Furkers asks to be sent back to the demon world to continue his nap. Norman formally dismisses Furkers, the 50th ranked demon, granting him permission to return to his world. As he vanishes, Furkers cryptically remarks that the day Norman becomes the Demon King may not be far off. Norman is left confused by the demon's parting words. Orobas reminds his master to stay vigilant, as even non-aggressive demons can be difficult, and Norman agrees. Clutching his grimoire, Norman reminds himself that he is dealing with forbidden arts and cannot let his guard down. He knows that Orobas and Furkers are likely exceptions and that most demons could be as rebellious as Aim. Though he's scared, he's come too far to stop now, having mastered the binding spell and fire magic. He resolves to summon and use any demon necessary to finally defeat Regal. Norman begins the summoning ritual, calling upon the water guardian who has drowned in sin. He commands the entity to emerge from the endless beyond and reveal itself in his name. He finishes the spell, calling forth the 49th ranked demon, Krosel. Orobas stands ready as the summoning circle activates. A soft wing brushes against Norman's face as a gentle voice speaks, telling him to love his fellow man and worship the Lord, leaving him utterly speechless. Before him stands not a demon, but a beautiful woman with a halo and magnificent angel wings, leaving Norman to wonder why he has summoned an angel. In a flashback, Norman recounts summoning the 39th demon, Malphaz, to repair the house Aim had destroyed. Following Orobaz's advice, he collected mineral and glass shards as an offering. Orobaz presented the shiny objects to Malphaz in exchange for repairing the house. Orobaz explained that Malphaz would build a structure matching the value of the shiny offering, which the crow-like demon eagerly accepted. An hour later, the house was perfectly rebuilt, and both Norman and Orobaz were amazed by Malphaz's architectural skill. Norman thanked Malphaz and eagerly went to look inside, but Orobaz tried to stop him. It was too late. Norman fell into a pitfall trap just inside the doorway. As Malphaz cackled, Orobaz apologized, admitting he forgot to mention that the demon was a bit of a prankster. Norman stares in shock, white feathers floating around him. He had intended to summon a demon. Before him stands a beautiful winged woman, and he can't understand why an angel has appeared. The angel preaches about loving one's neighbor and worshipping the Lord. Her expression sours as she admits she no longer feels that way, having been banished from heaven. Orobaz steps in, correctly identifying her as a fallen angel and greeting her. Norman processes this new information. Some demons are former angels cast out from heaven. The fallen angel is lost in a desperate prayer, pleading for the Lord's forgiveness so she can return to heaven. She notices the grimoire in his hands, identifying it as the Ars Goetia, and Norman confirms it. She realizes with horror that she's being treated as a demon, a thought that fills her with despair. Norman explains that he summoned her, Crocel, to make a request. She agrees to listen, seeing it as her duty to guide lost lambs, even as a fallen angel. Norman asks her to teach him water magic. The request makes her recoil in shock. Despite his pleas for help, she refuses to use her water powers. Crocel screams her absolute refusal. Crocel declares that she has been suppressing her power as part of her long repentance and will not use it until her sins are forgiven. Confused, Norman asks what sins she committed. He offers to do anything she asks if it would help. She clarifies that she did not fall willingly and finds it insulting to be grouped with other demons. When he again offers his help, she scoffs, questioning what a mere human could possibly do. Her composure breaks as she desperately asks if he can save her from her darkness and suffering. Norman stands silently, unable to answer. He admits he cannot help her. Defeated, Crocel asks to be returned to the demon world. Orobaz remarks that just as Furkaz said, she isn't aggressive but is certainly difficult. He suggests they find another demon, since she wished to be left alone. Orobaz explains there are two types of fallen angels, and he believes Crocel was banished after committing a sin. Norman empathizes with her frustration at being cast down by God. He recalls the moment he himself was mercilessly banished from his family. Norman reflects on Crocel's desperate plea for help. He realizes she wanted to be rescued from an endless darkness, a feeling he understands all too well. Determined, he turns to his demon companion and asks Orobaz to tell him something. He asks if there is any way for a fallen angel to return to heaven. Orobaz looks at his master somberly before answering that unfortunately there is not. He explains that once an angel has fallen, they can never return to heaven. It is, he concludes, a story without salvation. Norman quietly accepts the grim reality. He can only imagine how many times Crocel must have repented, all while knowing she could never return to heaven. Orobaz suggests it would be more practical for Norman to focus on his pseudo-magic training with other demons. Norman can't bring himself to give up on Crocel, seeing his own situation in hers and knowing how hard it is to live without hope. He asks Orobaz to bear with his selfishness a while longer, as he wants to help Crocel, even if it's just a little. Orobaz is confident that if Norman sincerely confronts her, Crocel will open her heart. With renewed purpose, Norman tells Orobaz he's going out for a while. He spends his nights studying and planning. During the day, he works tirelessly, gathering materials. He stands before his finished construction project. Orobaz watches his master, hoping his feelings will reach Crocel. Norman begins the summoning ritual again, but this time his words are different. He commands Crocel, the 49th in ranking, to come forth in his name. Her eyes snap open. Crocel finds herself in a vast field of white flowers, bathed in heavenly light. Norman and Orobaz stand before her. In the center of the field is a stone altar, upon which she now sits, a monument standing behind her. The entire scene is a carefully crafted sanctuary, a stark contrast to the dark ritual that summoned her. As Crossel takes in her surroundings, Norman explains that this is a sacred hill where an angel was said to have descended long ago. He tells her he built this altar of angel worship so he could summon her as an angel, promising never to treat her like a demon again. He asks her to tell him of her suffering. He declares he can't leave her alone and will give up water magic if he can't save her heart. Orobas adds that Norman did all this on his own, a gesture of his desire to be close to her. Crossel listens, her expression softening. Holding a small bouquet of flowers, Norman looks at her with earnest sincerity and says he wants to be her strength. A memory flashes in her mind of a similar boy, long ago, who called her Angel-san. Her eyes well up with tears. He asks if she will let him. Crossel asks if he truly wants to listen to her confession of sins. Norman simply replies yes. With gentle encouragement, he asks her to tell him everything. Crossel begins her story, recalling a time before her fall from grace when she descended to the lower world to observe humans. It was there she met a young boy who cheerfully asked her to play with him. She, however, rebuffed him, stating she was not there for games. The boy confirmed that she was the angel he had been seeking. As a divine instrument, Crossel had fewer emotions then, and she told the persistent boy she was too busy to play. Undeterred, he suggested they talk instead. He then proudly gave her a tour of his village, showing her the fields, the river, and the grazing goats. He led her to the altar where they prayed to God and the angels. The boy expressed his awe, saying he never thought he would meet an angel. He believed it was God's guidance that brought them together. As Crossel prepared to leave, he asked if they would meet again. She told him they would if he believed it. And so she began to visit the boy frequently. Little by little, she started to develop feelings. One day, the boy told Crossel he had a place to show her. He led her to a vast, beautiful field of flowers. He happily told her it was the best time to see it. Crossel was captivated by the sight. The boy shared wonderful news. He was going to have a sibling soon, and Crossel told him she was happy for him. He wanted to thank God for creating this beautiful world. He professed his love for everything in it, from the plants and animals to his family and the villagers. He hoped she would watch over him as he strived to become a strong older brother. Crossel assured him that the Lord was surely listening. But then another angel appeared, delivering a divine trial. Crossel was ordered to use the power of the water goddess to cause a great flood in that very village. She couldn't understand why. The armored angel admonished her for questioning God's words. Crossel desperately tried to explain the goodness of the villagers. She spoke of the young boy's pure devotion and gratitude for the world. She cried out, asking why they would be subjected to such a harsh trial. The only answer she received was that it was the way of the world. This cold justification broke her. She refused to accept such a terrible world. Her defiance solidified into a single powerful thought: she did not like it. In her rebellion, her halo shattered. She turned against the heavenly host. Despite her love for the world, she was betrayed by it. As the floodwaters rose, caused by the water goddess, she found it all unreasonably unfair. She fought back, refusing to let the villagers be destroyed. She saved the boy and his family from the rising water. The injustice of it all fueled her rage. She would not accept this fate. Suddenly, the waters began to recede. The villagers checked on one another, relieved that everyone was safe. Amidst the debris, a single white feather drifted down into the boy's hands. He looked up at the sky, wondering about the angel. For the crime of devouring the water goddess and rebelling against the gods, Crossel was banished from the heavens. As she pleaded to her lord, a divine voice echoed with regret. It told her that she should never have been created. She was sentenced to eternal torment in the depths of the abyss. Finishing her story, Crossel tells them this is the sin she bears. Orobas calls it a terrible tale. Norman asks her if she regrets helping that boy. With quiet determination, Crossel says no, she doesn't regret it at all. Tears streaming down her face, Crossel cries that she can't forgive herself. She took pride in serving God, yet she cannot sincerely repent for her sins. She knows it was a sin, but she was still happy the boy was alive. She vows not to forgive herself until her heart changes. Norman simply thanks her for sharing her story. Norman tells her that if he were that boy, he would have something to say. He would be relieved that no one lost their lives in such an unfair trial. He relates to her, admitting he also committed a taboo to get his family back. He argues that while God's rules may call it evil, From a human perspective, saving people's lives is not wrong. He tells her she's been punished enough with her fall from grace and that it's time to stop blaming themselves. Reaching out his hand, Norman tells her that even if God does not forgive her, he will. Crossel looks at him, tears welling in her eyes, completely stunned by his words. In that moment, Crossel understands her salvation was not in the heavens she was cast out from, her God was here all along. As their hands touch, Crossel makes a new vow. She offers Norman her body and all the power of water she possesses. With a tearful smile, she asks him to guide her. He accepts, promising to help her fulfill her wish. Norman arrives at a small, rustic house, a place that feels familiar. A young woman with long, dark hair knocks on the gate. Norman opens the door to welcome his visitor. He is surprised to see his sister, Nene, who greets him with a wide smile, happy to see her brother after a long time. Nene thanks him for reading her letter, but Norman says he's just relieved she's away from their brother Dimitri and their father. Nene confesses she's glad to be with him now. She recounts how Dimitri torments the servants for his magic practice and their father does nothing to stop it. The situation became so unbearable that many of the staff quit and Nene felt powerless to help. She then asks Norman if he has any servants of his own. Nene comments on how nice the house is, surprised since she'd heard it was in ruins. Norman explains that a helpful acquaintance has been assisting with housework. As Oroba's preens in the background, invisible to her, Norman clarifies they only met recently. He then tries to bring up the real reason for his letter. But Nene interrupts, correctly guessing that he wants her to teach him spiritualism. The conversation shifts back to Norman and his demonic companions, with Crossel questioning the use of spiritualism. He explains that since he can't use natural magic, he plans to use it to absorb power, just as he did with Ames. Norman reveals his plan to use the same method to absorb Crossel's water power, but she is worried, admitting she has no experience with such a thing. Crossel and Orobas agree that the risk to Norman is too great, and they must find another way. Norman concludes that he must learn to use spiritualism himself, though Crossel is unsure of her ability to teach him. Orobas suggests asking a skilled demon for help, but Norman prefers to learn it himself to avoid the risks. He laments that his own magical abilities are still too new to ask his teacher for help. Suddenly, he has a realization: there might be someone in his own family who can teach him. Nene agrees to teach him, though she cautions that spiritualism won't be a match for powerful magic. Norman insists, saying that while he can't explain why, it's exactly what he needs right now. Nene muses that it might be a good idea, and with that settled, she declares they will begin at once. Nene begins the lesson, explaining they will summon the spirit of their ancestor, Dargana Esland, a famed warrior who combined swordsmanship with magic. She explains that using an intermediary like the ancestor's sword makes the summoning more likely to succeed, and their blood relation ensures compatibility. She sternly warns Norman to know his limits. Nene explains that absorbing too much power will overwhelm him, while too little will leave him weak, making the balance difficult to achieve. Nene tells Norman to watch closely as she begins the incantation, asking the spirit to listen to her wish and dedicate its abilities to her. She commands the spirit to dwell within her body, filling it with knowledge and power as she summons Dargana Esland by name. A profound silence falls over the room as Nene stands perfectly still, the sword held before her. Norman watches with concern, calling out her name. Her posture shifts, her grip tightening on the hilt, as she expertly draws the blade. With a sharp, determined gaze, Nene holds the massive sword upright, declaring the summoning a success. Norman is stunned, asking how she can hold such a heavy sword with just one hand. Possessed by their ancestor's spirit, Nene explains that her body is moving on instinct, filled with swordsmanship techniques she has never learned. She decides to give him a demonstration outside, and Norman follows, asking what she plans to do. Nene simply tells him to watch as she approaches a large boulder, judging it a suitable target. With a powerful swing, Nene slices cleanly through the massive rock, sending fragments flying in all directions. Norman and his companions are left in absolute shock by the display of power. Nene casually remarks that this is the essence of the technique. She explains that it combines Dargana's swordsmanship with her own magic, allowing spiritualism to enhance her movements and techniques. Inspired by her power, Norman smiles back, determined to succeed, and says he'll try his best. With the demonstration complete, Nene thanks the spirit of Dargana Esland and returns all that she borrowed. She performs the spiritualism release, freeing herself from his influence. Nene asks Norman if he has any questions, but he feels that seeing it in person was more than enough. Orobas and Crosel are still amazed that a single strike could cleave a boulder in two. Nene explains that the high success rate was due to her being a relative and using the sword as a proper offering. With the lesson over, Nene prepares to head home. Norman offers to walk with her, but she declines, saying she has errands to run. Before leaving, she urges her brother to start practicing right away, knowing he needs it. Waving goodbye, she promises to visit again and tells him to call if he needs anything. Once Nene is gone, Norman allows Orobas and Crosel to materialize. He's eager to practice, but needs a relic to act as an offering for Crosel. Orobas suggests using the Ars Gosha itself as a substitute for the offering. He explains that the book possesses its own magical power and can connect a summoner and a demon. Norman agrees to use the Ars Gosha for the ritual. Crosel worries about finding the right balance, wishing for a guideline. Norman decides to use the same mental image he used with aim to control the flow of Crosel's power. He asks if she is ready. Crosel nervously agrees. Norman begins the incantation, dedicating all of his abilities to the task. He calls out to Crosel, pleading for her to dwell within his body and fill it with her knowledge and power, commanding her to come forth. Crosel's spiritual form appears before them. Orobas excitedly asks if the ritual was a success. He notices something is wrong as Norman stands silently, unresponsive. Norman's body begins to tremble violently. Suddenly, Norman coughs up a large amount of black blood. The dark liquid splatters across the floor, and the book as Orobas cries out his master's name in alarm. Orobas rushes to Norman's side, urging him to be careful as he collapses in agony. Norman realizes this is completely different from when he absorbed Aim's power. He understands his mistake too late. Using spiritualism to summon a demon is a forbidden taboo. As his life force drains away, Norman fears he will die. Orobas desperately begs him to focus his consciousness on a single point, just as he did with Aim. He pleads for him to endure and not let his mind break. Fighting through the pain, Norman latches onto his words, struggling to concentrate. The effort is too much, and he feels his consciousness slipping away. A fleeting memory of his family surfaces in his mind. He finally collapses into darkness. In the void of his mind, Crosel's voice calls to him, asking him not to reject her. She gently coaxes him to surrender himself to her embrace. With a groan, Norman begins to stir, his eyes fluttering open. He awakens to find a materialized Crosel kneeling before him, who looks at him with concern and asks if he is really her master. Confused by her question, he asks what she means. He looks down at his own hands and body, noticing something is very wrong. The realization of what has happened sinks in, filling him with horror. A panicked scream echoes from the house. Norman recounts the disastrous outcome of his first attempt at spiritualism. Using the technique he learned from his sister, he had tried to summon Crosel. But the ritual went awry, resulting in him being transformed into a woman, specifically into Crosel's body. Panicked by his new form, Norman questions what's happening to his body. He calls out to Crosel, hearing her voice respond directly in his mind. She explains that the ritual failed. While his soul is safe, his body couldn't handle the strain. Norman is flustered when Crosel points out that his hands are now on her chest, causing him to apologize profusely. Orobas speculates that, unlike Aim, Crosel hadn't held back her power, leading to this result. Concerned for his master's well-being, Orobas suggests undoing the spirit channeling. Norman agrees and begins the incantation to release Crosel's spirit and return her power. However, as he finishes the chant, he realizes something is wrong. To his horror, Norman discovers that he can't transform back to his original body. He wonders why he's stuck when Nene could reverse her spiritualism so easily. Just then the door opens and Nene walks in, explaining she forgot something. She stops short, confused by the sight of a stranger in her brother's room, while Norman realizes Orobas has vanished in a hurry. As Nene asks who he is, Norman panics internally, realizing this is the worst possible timing. In the midst of Norman's panic, Crosel telepathically asks to borrow his body for a moment, and he agrees. She takes control and boldly introduces herself to Nene as Crosel, Norman's girlfriend, much to Norman's internal shock. While Norman frets that this will only complicate things, Crosel mentally reassures him that this is the most natural solution. Surprised by the news of her brother's girlfriend, Nene is momentarily speechless. She quickly recovers and introduces herself as Norman's sister. Nene then immediately starts asking a barrage of questions about their relationship, making Norman feel she's being very aggressive. Nene asks where her brother is, and Crossel vaguely replies that he'll be away for a while. Nene mentions she was teaching him about spiritualism earlier. Seizing the opportunity, Crossel explains that Norman was having difficulty undoing a spiritual possession and asks Nene for advice. Nene is surprised, remarking that it's usually easier to undo a possession than perform one, and wonders what he channeled. Crossel calmly answers, a fallen angel. Nene explains the key to undoing the possession. One must vividly imagine their former self and strongly wish to return to it. Hearing this, Norman has a somber realization. He understands that, unconsciously, he doesn't want to go back to being his powerless self. Crossel voices Norman's fear to Nene, suggesting he's afraid of returning to his old self. She explains he fears being called incompetent and unable to protect his family. Nene dismisses this immediately, stating that none of it matters. She declares that she loves her hardworking and kind older brother, regardless of whether he can use magic or not. Having retrieved what she came for, Nene prepares to leave, asking Crossel to tell her brother not to overwork himself. She waves goodbye to Crossel-san as she departs. Once Nene is gone, Orobas reappears, deeply moved by the beautiful display of sibling love. Touched by his sister's words, Norman feels a new resolve and closes his eyes. He once again begins the spiritualism release. A bright light envelops Norman's borrowed form as the spiritualism is successfully released. Crossel, now in her own body, exclaims that she is back. Orobas watches with joy as his master returns. Norman looks on with a gentle, relieved smile. Orobas expresses his relief at Norman's safe return, crediting Nene's advice. Norman reflects that instead of wishing to go back, he must accept his former self as he is. Realizing that Nene's love allows him to accept himself, incompetent or not, he feels truly glad to have her as his sister. Filled with newfound confidence, Norman eagerly asks Crossel to practice spirit channeling with him again. Orobas gently intervenes, reminding his master that his sister just told him not to overwork himself. Norman pauses, realizing his demon butler is right. Changing his mind, Norman smiles and suggests they all have some tea instead. Orobas happily agrees to his master's wish. In a grand, open-air arena, Regal trains intensely with a partner. His companion asks why they are focusing on swordsmanship instead of magic, but Regal deflects the question. The partner presses for an answer, feeling he's earned the right to know after all his help. Regal finally admits that he lost to their opponent in swordsmanship and is now preparing for the worst. Regal's partner is incredulous, questioning the idea of a worst-case scenario against someone with advanced magic. Regal warns that while Norman may be called incompetent, he is not stupid. He reminds his partner that he, of all people, should know this best after fighting Norman. Regal explains that any sign of carelessness will be exploited, which is why this training is necessary. As a noble carrying the weight of the Randalls family, Regal declares that he cannot afford to lose. With grim determination, Regal vows to defeat Norman and advance to the finals of the magic tournament. At Crossel's command, Norman is to strike with all his might. He unleashes a water blade attack. The attack shatters part of a large boulder. Crossel notes that his technique is starting to take shape. Despite the progress, Norman is discouraged, lamenting that this is all he's achieved after 2 weeks of training. Crossel urges Norman to take a break, but he insists on trying again. She points out that he has been practicing for over 5 hours and needs to rest. Worried he won't make it in time, Norman asks if there's a more intense way to train, even if it's rough. Crossel tells him that proper training will lead to success, but questions his desperation to master water magic. Norman explains that he was exiled from the Esland family because he couldn't use magic. His father adopted someone else as the heir and was an oppressive man who even raised his hand against Nene. He feels bound by a promise to his late mother to protect their family and must return as the rightful heir by winning the tournament and attending Zeno's academy. However, he feels that with only his swordsmanship and beginner fire magic, he stands no chance of defeating Regal. He explains that water magic, while difficult, is versatile and will give him more strategic options. With the limited time he has, he wants to do everything he can. Moved by his story, Crossel understands. She reveals an extreme method to make magic easier to control, fusing her water magic power with the water inside his body. She explains that magic is difficult because it involves borrowing power from external forces one doesn't fully understand. However, combining magic with something already within, like one's own strength, makes it far easier to handle. Norman is shocked by the idea of using the water in his body. Norman realizes she means his blood. Crossel confirms it, explaining that blood allows for a much more potent fusion than tears or sweat. She warns him that while the fusion is simple, using too much blood could be fatal. Norman wonders why AIM never taught him this, and Crossel explains that AIM is naturally rebellious towards summoners. She then asks Norman if he knows why powerful beings will lend their power, but never truly combine their strength with humans. The reason, Crossel explains, is that such a fusion could create a force beyond human control. This power could endanger not just humans but the spirits themselves, which is why it became a taboo after countless conflicts. Norman asks what this means for her. Crossel simply states that right now she is serving him. Crossel declares that she will grant his wish, even if it costs her life. Norman is moved by her dedication. He takes her hand and thanks her sincerely. He promises to master the magic while ensuring they both remain safe, as he doesn't want her to disappear either. His earnest vow leaves Crossel flustered. She agrees, still blushing from his words. Crossel instructs Norman to first create a simple sphere of water. She then tells him to let his blood flow into it, and he asks if he needs to cut himself. She clarifies that he only needs to imagine sending his blood through her sigil. Focusing, Norman repeats her instruction. He concentrates, channeling his blood into the water sphere. Norman watches in amazement as the water sphere turns red, swirling with his blood. Crossel confirms the fusion was a success and tells him to fire it. Norman unleashes the blood-infused water blade. The attack obliterates the large boulder with explosive force. Norman is stunned by the incredible power of the attack. He suddenly feels dizzy and stumbles, explaining that the technique consumes a lot of blood and can't be used repeatedly. Pondering how to stand against Regal, he realizes he'll need to be creative to avoid becoming anemic in a fight. An idea strikes him as he pictures Regal's flame lion, a new method coming to mind. Orobas arrives, checking his pocket watch and noting the late hour. He calls out to his master and Crossel, suggesting it's time to wrap things up. Crossel turns, her expression suddenly one of shock. Orobas also freezes, staring in disbelief at what he sees. Before them, a colossal, jellyfish-like creature made of the blood-infused water has manifested, its tentacles writhing around a bewildered Norman. In a massive coliseum packed with spectators, an announcer declares the start of the second match of the Magic Tournament preliminaries, with the winner advancing to the main event. In the arena below, two figures face each other, Norman Esland and Regal Randalls. Watching from a distance, Crossel admits she was too worried about Norman to stay away. In the stands, spectators spot Norman's sister Nene. Others murmur in surprise that the incompetent Norman made it this far, recalling how the crowd booed his awful fighting style. Nene herself clasps her hands, silently calling out to her brother and Regal. Elsewhere in the stands, a woman with long braided hair greets a man named Rudon. He seems surprised to see her at the preliminaries, but she nonchalantly states she's taking a break from her duties. With a keen interest, she looks toward the arena, curious to see what kind of fight the two nobles will put on. The referee announces that the match ends when a combatant is out of bounds or unable to fight, and with a cry of "begin," the fight is underway. Regal immediately challenges Norman, questioning if his presence means he actually has a plan to win. Norman calmly replies that he won't know until he tries. Accepting this, Regal tells him to come at him with everything he has and summons a powerful spell, a blazing tempest. The crowd recoils in shock, exclaiming, "Not again." Norman looks on, startled by the sheer force of the attack. Regal's magic tears through the arena floor, a display of destructive power they've seen before. Amidst the chaos, the spectators wonder if Norman could have possibly survived such a devastating attack. As the dust settles, a massive crimson jellyfish made of water appears, shielding Norman. Regal stares in disbelief at the unexpected defense. The crowd is stunned, questioning how a basic aqua manifestation spell could block Regal's attack, especially one of such unprecedented size. Crossel observes that Norman correctly predicted the attack and managed to block it, though the jellyfish is evaporating quickly. In the arena, Regal acknowledges Norman's mastery of water magic, to which Norman admits it was a close call. Norman explains that since he could never overpower Regal's magic, he focused on finding a way to block his attacks instead. Regal scoffs, agreeing that someone like Norman could never defeat him. He tells Norman to accept his loss gracefully and prepares another attack, a stone barrage. Norman uses the jellyfish to shield himself from the barrage of stone projectiles. He explains that offensive water spells are like arrows, disappearing once fired. However, water manifestation simply brings water into existence, allowing it to remain. As long as he can maintain the jellyfish, he won't need to expend any more of his blood. That is why he created the largest jellyfish he could to use as a shield. The stone barrage continues to pelt the jellyfish shield as Norman defends. Growing impatient, Regal taunts Norman, asking how long he plans to hide and calling him a coward. Norman, sweating from the effort, steels himself, determined to hold on a little longer. Seeing his resolve, Regal decides that talking is pointless. Regal declares he will skewer Norman from every direction as dozens of magic circles appear. Norman recognizes this as a powerful advanced spell. Realizing the danger, Norman knows this is bad. Regal smirks, identifying it as his signature magic. Regal unleashes his ultimate attack, Silver World. Beams of light converge on Norman from all directions, a seemingly inescapable assault. In a surprising move, Norman leaps into his own jellyfish, allowing himself to be swallowed by it. Regal and the crowd watch in disbelief, wondering if he was just swallowed. The blades of light rain down, striking the surface of the water creature. The crowd gasps, realizing that the attacks aren't hitting Norman inside the water. Regal quickly figures it out. Norman is creating ripples on the water's surface from within, altering the trajectory of the magical blades. Norman's friend in the stands is astounded that he managed to block Regal's signature magic, calling it an incredible defense. Others note that Norman has only been defending and hasn't counterattacked once. His friend reasons that against an opponent as strong as Regal, a purely defensive strategy must have a specific purpose. The friend has a realization: Norman might be trying to make Regal run out of magic power. Another spectator explains that signature magic is a high-difficulty spell that consumes a lot of mana. The friend speculates that Norman's plan is to force Regal to exhaust himself by continuously defending. He quickly dismisses his own speculation, thinking of it as another one of Norman's dirty tactics. The surrounding crowd overhears, mocking Norman for his cheap strategy, causing his friend to feel apologetic. Regal notes the crowd's jeers and asks if Norman still has no intention of fighting him head-on. Norman openly admits that no matter how hard he tries, he can't beat Regal when it comes to magic. He states that he is, as everyone says, incompetent. Norman explains he has come to terms with this and decided to keep fighting as he is. This admission infuriates Regal, who snarls that this is exactly what he hates about Norman. Regal angrily demands to know how Norman can so easily accept being called incompetent. He argues that Norman's attitude tramples on the feelings of those who still have expectations for him. He yells at Norman not to give up on himself, calling him an idiot. Norman quietly tells Regal he's wrong. He asks him not to place such expectations on someone like him, as it's useless. He explains that since he couldn't use natural magic, he had no choice but to rely on the taboo of demons. He confesses that because of this, he felt he couldn't stand by Regal's side. Norman admits it would have been easier if Regal had just mocked him like everyone else. Instead, Regal's straightforward words and eyes forced him to confront a reality he wanted to escape, which was suffocating. With a faint, pained smile, Norman admits that he hates that straightforward part of Regal too. Regal stares back, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Regal reflects on his past, recalling his birth as the eldest son of the noble Randall's family, a life that began with high expectations. He grew up with every need met by servants, receiving special treatment throughout his childhood. Watching other children play from his window, he felt a growing sense of isolation. Despite his comfortable life, a deep sense of loneliness began to creep into his routine existence. Prodded by his mother, a shy boy named Norman Esland introduced himself. Regal returned the introduction, stating his own name. It was during one of these noble social gatherings that Regal and Norman first met, shaking hands formally. Regal admitted that his life of constant study and magic training was boring, while Norman mentioned he had his little sister Nene to talk to. Regal confessed that he had no siblings or friends. Seizing the opportunity, Norman suggested they become friends. Regal was surprised by the sudden offer. Norman smiled, solidifying their new friendship with a simple confirmation. Regal often visited Norman at his family's estate. One day, Regal excitedly showed off his ability to conjure a small flame, much to Norman's amazement. Norman expressed his own hope to use magic soon. Regal confidently reassured him that he would be able to use magic in no time. Norman agreed, placing his trust in his friend's words. Regal explained that seeing Norman work so hard motivated him to do his best as well. He proposed that they strive together to support their country. Norman added that they would become the strongest magicians. The two friends sealed their promise with a fist bump. At age 10, Regal was already skipping grades and entering school early, earning praise from the household staff. As he walked the halls, he overheard them gossiping about his friend Norman. They whispered rumors that Norman might be completely unable to use magic. Furious, Regal burst in on the servants, shouting that Norman wasn't like that. He declared that Norman's hard work pushed him to be better and that they would become the strongest magicians together. He stormed off, warning them not to dare insult his friend. Alone, Regal resolved to master even the most difficult spells so he could teach Norman everything he knew. Regal asked Nene where her brother was, and she directed him to the underground library. He found Norman and presented him with a simplified guide to natural magic he had created. Norman was touched by the gesture and promised to give it a try. But as a year passed and they both turned 11, things began to change. Tragedy struck when Norman's mother passed away. From that day forward, something ignited within Norman, and he threw himself even deeper into the study of magic. Concerned, Regal found Norman in the library and asked if he was okay. He then gently inquired about Norman's progress with magic. Norman replied that he still couldn't do anything, not even hear the spirits' voices. Regal tried to reassure him, promising he'd be able to use magic one day. Norman then turned the question back on him, asking about his progress. Regal reluctantly admitted he'd been advanced to the upper-level classes that year. The news was met with a heavy silence from Norman. Norman forced a smile, congratulating Regal on his amazing achievement. He then mentioned that his sister Nene was also skipping grades to enroll. Regal noted that she had mastered basic magic and even showed a talent for difficult healing magic. Norman credited Nene's incredible progress to the reference book Regal had given her. With a serious expression, Norman told Regal he had a favor to ask, and Regal promised he would do anything. Norman's favor was simple. He asked Regal to stop worrying about him. Regal was stunned, asking why. Norman confessed that being around Regal was painful, a constant reminder of his own powerlessness. He insisted it wasn't Regal's fault, but his own for being talentless. He added that someone who couldn't use magic had no place by Regal's side, fearing it would lead to bad rumors. Regal, shocked and hurt, could only call the idea ridiculous. Norman coldly stated that someone blessed with talent like Regal wouldn't understand. His words hit Regal hard, making him wonder if he had been pushing Norman into a corner. He had only wanted to master advanced magic so he could teach and help his friend. All he had ever wanted was to stand beside him. As Norman turned to leave, apologizing, he walked away from his friend. Regal shouted that he hated Norman, though his inner thoughts vowed he would be waiting. As Norman walked away, he thought of Regal as a liar, knowing he'd always believed in him. With tears streaming down his face, Regal called him a coward, internally pleading for him to catch up. As Norman reached the door, he begged his friend not to give up, a thought only he could hear. Regal doesn't care if Norman hates him, he will keep moving forward as a guiding star because of their promise. He is determined and will not allow Norman to give up. He silently urges his friend to hurry up and catch up to him. From a balcony overlooking the arena, Rudon-sensei and another teacher observed the duel, impressed by the high level of magic on display from both Norman and Regal. The curly-haired teacher turns to Rudon, asking who he thinks will win the evenly matched bout. Students in the crowd speculate on the outcome, noting that Regal's victory hinges on finding a way to deal with the formidable jellyfish construct. Rudon finds the unfolding battle very interesting. The students in the stands resolve to watch the fight to its conclusion. Down in the arena, Norman and Regal face off, separated by the swirling water construct. Rudon wonders how these gifted students will proceed from this impasse. Regal realizes that all his elemental and unique magic has been nullified, concluding that water magic would be useless as well. Suddenly, Norman's water construct lunges forward, its tendrils rushing towards an unprepared Regal. Regal is caught completely off guard by the sudden attack. As the tendrils ensnare his opponent, Norman declares that he's got him. Trapped within the construct, Regal understands that the jellyfish is also an offensive weapon. Norman's plan is simple and brutal, to suffocate his opponent. However, Regal refuses to be underestimated and begins to cast a spell from inside the watery prison. Norman looks on in shock as Regal prepares to retaliate. Regal unleashes a powerful lightning spell, Thunder Break, which erupts violently from within the water construct. Norman, exhausted and thrown back, is dismayed to see his jellyfish shield completely dispersed. The crowd erupts in shock, amazed that Regal used lightning magic to destroy the giant jellyfish shield. Norman realizes he's in a bad spot, having exhausted the blood needed for his construct and unable to use it again. Regal stands over his fallen opponent, demanding to know if he can still fight. Norman slowly gets to his feet, brandishing a dagger. Regal acknowledges that Norman was, in fact, hiding a weapon. Regal uses magic to summon a sword from the stone floor of the arena. Norman, dagger in hand, declares he will take him on. Regal announces his intention to end the fight by combining both magic and swordplay. In the stands, Art expresses his surprise that Regal is resorting to swordsmanship, while others warn that he has been training relentlessly. Facing Regal, Norman admits that he can only use fire and water magic. He concedes that with just those two, he can't beat an opponent who can use so many powerful spells. Norman confesses that his strategy to stall and wear Regal down was a miscalculation. He then throws his dagger high into the arches of the Colosseum. Regal watches the strange maneuver, trying to figure out what Norman is planning. Regal looks up in surprise. He spots the dagger embedded high up in the Colosseum wall. Confused, he wonders when Norman managed to place it there. Norman explains that the residual elements from his decomposed water construct can be used to amplify even basic fire magic. Norman tells Regal that he will be borrowing his power for this. The teacher observing the match realizes with alarm what is about to happen. He shouts for the defense squad to intervene immediately. Norman utters a single word to activate his spell, Ignite. A massive explosion erupts, tearing through the upper levels of the Colosseum. Shields protecting them, the curly-haired teacher checks on his hooded colleague, who confirms she's all right. He laments what a troublesome student Norman is for causing such a large-scale explosion. Looking down at the smoke-filled arena, he concludes that the match is settled. He calls for the referee to deliver the official verdict. The referee announces that both fighters are unable to continue. Therefore, the match is officially declared a draw. The scene shifts to the school infirmary. Regal groans, slowly regaining consciousness. He asks where he is, and his friend Art tells him he's awake and that his match ended in a draw. Regal immediately asks about Norman's condition. Art informs him that Norman is recovering in the adjacent bed. Norman stirs, weakly calling out Regal's name. Regal sits bolt upright, suddenly asking who gets to advance to the finals since their match was a draw. Art explains that the faculty has been in a long meeting to decide the outcome. Just then, the teacher from the stands enters, announcing that a decision has been made. He addresses Norman, pointing out that the explosion was an indiscriminate blast that put others at risk. The teacher reminds Norman that even with safety measures in place, such recklessness is unacceptable. Norman quietly agrees, understanding that his desperate strategy is not something to be praised. The teacher instructs Norman to reflect on his actions. He then turns to Regal, also admonishing him for causing so much destruction to the arena. As the teacher begins to announce the verdict, he is abruptly pushed aside by a flustered Rudon sensei. The headmaster makes a grand entrance, declaring that she will deliver the results herself, shocking both Norman and Regal. The headmaster explains that since a draw is unprecedented, the faculty debated a double loss or a coin toss, but she felt eliminating such talent after such an entertaining fight would be a waste. She recalls telling the faculty she was adding a new rule: if a match is a draw, both combatants who gave their all should advance to the finals. She turns to the boys and offers her congratulations. She officially declares that both of them are advancing to the Magic Tournament finals, but adds that there is a condition. The headmaster explains that as part of their extracurricular training, they will each complete 3 quests from an adventurer's guild to satisfy any complaints about her decision. She challenges them to go out into the world and prove their worth. Orobas cries out his master's name, tears streaming down his face. Crosel is equally emotional, wailing for her lord. The 2 demons pull Norman into a tight hug, telling him how worried they were. Norman apologizes for his recklessness. His demons recall the terrifying explosion, and Norman admits he was reckless. He thanks them for their unwavering support during his training. His words bring tears of joy to Oroba's and Crosel's eyes. Orobas reminds Norman that before the tournament, they must complete the headmaster's task of finishing 3 guild requests. Norman realizes he needs to learn wind and earth magic, as all his opponents have mastered the 4 basic elements. He reflects on his recent match, recognizing that with only fire and water magic, he'll be at a huge disadvantage against opponents with more versatile powers like lightning. Orobas explains that mastering more elements will give Norman more techniques and a greater advantage in battle. This means he'll need to summon new demons, so Orobas asks Crosel for recommendations. Crosel suggests Focalar for wind magic and Argars for earth magic. Crosel confirms that both demons are safe to summon, and Norman decides to start with wind magic. She brings up the 2-demon limit, offering to return to the demon realm so he can summon Focalar. Norman notes that Orobas adamantly refuses to leave his side. Crosel makes Norman promise to summon her back immediately after he's finished, and he agrees. Norman opens his book to the entry for rank 49, Crosel. He formally commands her to return to the demon realm without resistance. As she vanishes, Crosel begs him to summon her back soon. Orobas watches, ready for what comes next. Norman announces he will begin the summoning, and Orobas promises to protect him. He recites the summoning chant, calling for the demon to heed his call. With a final command, he calls forth rank 41 Focalar. A pair of large, dark wings unfurl from the summoning circle. Norman mistakes the winged figure for another fallen angel, but the newly summoned demon questions his assessment. Norman and Orobas watch as the demon fully materializes. Focalar reveals her full form, admiring her own wings as she appears before them. Focalar quickly composes herself, while Norman observes that she seems pleased by the angel comparison. She notices Orobas and comments on Norman's rare ability to summon multiple demons. She turns her attention to Norman and asks what he requires of her. Norman introduces himself and plainly states he summoned her to learn wind magic. Focalar explains that she admires angels. She proudly claims her wings were torn from a magical beast to make herself look more like an angel, much to Orobas' shock. She describes the peaceful nature of angels, which is the complete opposite of her own destructive demonic power. This is why she refuses to easily teach her power to humans. Norman expresses his surprise, as he always assumed demons and angels were enemies. Focalar argues that admiration is, in fact, a demonic emotion. Norman muses that admiration is another form of desire, a trait humans share. Focalar likens the desire for the unreachable to her own desire for Norman's soul. She declares that if Norman wants to learn her magic, he must first prove himself worthy by passing her test. Norman reflects on how he became Focalar's test subject. He's surprised to learn her test involves helping him with his guild quests, which she is willing to do. As they walk, a stranger calls out to Norman and Orobas. At Norman's request, Focalar transforms into a physical form, appearing in a full maid's dress. When Orobas questions her choice, she explains it's to match his butler attire. Norman approves of the outfit, declaring it perfect for a servant, and decides they are ready to go. The trio arrives at the large guild hall. As they step inside, Norman announces their plan to register and accept quests. The interior is a bustling tavern, much to Orobas' displeasure. Focalar notes the strong smell of alcohol as Norman tries to hurry them along. A pair of drunken adventurers immediately mock Norman, telling him the guild is no place for a kid. Orobas is ready to retort, but Norman calmly tells him to ignore them. Norman steps up to the counter and politely asks the receptionist to register his party as adventurers. As he fills out the form, Norman and Focalar register as magicians, while Orobas registers as a fighter. With their forms filled out, the receptionist hands them their new guild cards. She directs them to the quest board to choose their tasks. Overwhelmed by the options, Norman decides they should start with easy quests. He quickly selects 3 requests from the board. One of the chosen quests is a cargo escort mission. Another is to gather materials at a nearby mine. The final quest is a search for a missing person. Holding the 3 notices, Norman announces that he has decided on their tasks. As Orobas announces they are ready to begin their first request, Norman agrees to get started right away. He asks Focalar how much help she is willing to provide, to which she replies that she will assist him until his task is complete. However, she makes it clear that she will not grant him her wind powers. Focalar reminds him that he is still under observation, and she will not lend her strength until she has judged him worthy. At the stables, they are greeted by their client, a man who asks if they are the guild members for the cargo escort. Norman introduces himself and explains that it's their first guild job, while Darius introduces himself in return, surprised by their youth. Darius tells them it's nothing too complicated and invites them aboard his wagon so he can explain as they travel. Norman asks if guards are always necessary, and Darius explains they are only needed when crossing the mountains due to bandits and monsters. He reassures them that this particular mountain is safe, calling it the perfect first job for the young adventurers. Faux-color listens silently from the back of the wagon. Darius explains their simple objective: deliver the cargo to the town on the other side of the mountain. He remarks on the beautiful weather, but his sentence trails off as he notices the clouds rolling in with unnatural speed. A sudden, powerful gust of wind rattles the wagon, catching everyone by surprise. The clear sky gives way to a sudden, torrential downpour. Norman suggests they stop and take cover, but Darius is adamant they keep moving to avoid being stranded in the mountains overnight. A loud clunk startles Norman, who realizes the danger and urgently tells Darius to find shelter immediately. Norman shouts that it has started to hail, and they need to move before anyone gets hurt. Darius replies that there is nowhere large enough to take cover with the wagon. Taking charge, Norman declares he will buy them time while Darius finds shelter. With a cry of water manifestation, he summons a massive, jellyfish-like creature of water to shield them from the storm. Norman instructs Orobas and Faux-color to deflect the larger hailstones that his water manifestation cannot block, while Darius looks on in amazement. Faux-color uses her power to deflect the hail. Orobas kicks away an incoming hailstone. Darius spots a large tree in the distance that he believes can provide them with adequate cover. After reaching the shelter of the tree, the group is dismayed to find the hail has turned into snow, causing the temperature to drop drastically. Norman notices Darius is shivering and looking unwell. He offers his robe to the man, who gratefully accepts it. Darius wonders aloud if this bizarre weather is some kind of natural disaster, deciding they should wait for it to clear up. An hour passes, but the blizzard only intensifies. Norman worries that the wagon and cargo will soon be completely buried in the snow. Just then, Darius mutters that they need to get down the mountain quickly before collapsing from the extreme cold. Norman quickly assesses the situation, realizing Darius is suffering from hypothermia. He knows the man's life is in danger if they don't get him off the mountain, but moving everyone with the wagon in this storm is too risky. When Orobas asks for his plan, Norman makes a difficult decision. They have no choice but to leave the wagon behind. He instructs Orobas to create a snow shelter to protect the horses and cargo, promising they will return for them once the blizzard clears. He then turns to Faux-color. Norman asks if she can fly him and Darius to the nearby town. Faux-color confirms it's possible, but questions if he is sure about his choice. Faux-color points out that abandoning the cargo will result in a failed mission. Norman firmly states that saving a life takes priority over the mission. Seeing his unwavering resolve, Faux-color agrees. With Darius securely fastened to his back, Norman declares they are ready. Orobas, however, insists on staying behind to guard everything, telling a concerned Norman not to worry. He assures his master that demons don't die easily and that he will bring the horses and cargo down once the blizzard clears. Norman turns to Faux-color, telling her he's counting on her. Faux-color unfurls her large, dark wings, preparing for takeoff. With a powerful beat of her wings, Faux-color launches into the sky, carrying both Norman and the unconscious Darius through the heart of the raging blizzard. After a harrowing flight, Norman spots the town below and instructs Faux-color to land somewhere discreet. Once on the ground, they quickly get directions to a clinic. They rush Darius inside, where he is immediately taken in for treatment. Norman and Faux-color wait, relieved to have got him to safety. As the sun begins to set, Norman worries about Orobas' safety. Just then, Orobas calls out to him, arriving with the wagon fully intact. Norman is overjoyed and asks how he managed to get through the snow. Orobas explains that the blizzard miraculously stopped right after they flew off, allowing him to clear a path and bring the horses and cargo down without issue. Norman asks about Darius, and Orobas reports that their client has regained consciousness and is no longer in danger. With Darius safe and the cargo delivered to its destination, Orobas declares their mission a success. Norman sincerely thanks Faux-color for her help, but she coolly replies that she just did what she was asked. As night falls over the town, the escort mission is officially complete. After reporting their success at the guild, the team is commended for their good work. Norman returns to his room, sighing in relief that one request is now done. He contemplates his next two tasks and the need to train for the magic tournament. Suddenly, he hears a knock at his door. It's Orobas who enters with a serious expression. He tells his master he has a warning for him concerning Focolor. Orobas bluntly tells Norman not to trust Focolor too much. He explains that her admiration for angels is merely a selfish desire and she does not genuinely care for humans. Norman listens and then smiles, reassuring his loyal demon that he is not that naive. Norman reveals that he knew Focolor had used wind magic to create the storm, viewing it as a test to see how he would react. Orobas is surprised that he noticed and didn't confront her, but Norman explains that he believes she is also searching for something within herself. Since she is willing to cooperate when asked, he sees no reason to back down now. With quiet determination, Norman tells Orobas that he will play along with Focolor's games for as long as it takes. Outside the room, Focolor stands in the hallway, having overheard their entire conversation. Her expression is unreadable. In a room lit by the starry night sky, Orobas admonishes Focolor for her incredibly reckless actions. He demands to know what she was thinking. Focolor listens silently to his accusation. Orobas questions Focolor's purpose in serving Norman. She calmly replies that a person's true nature emerges when they are cornered. She wanted to see if the young summoner would choose self-preservation or self-sacrifice. Orobas argues that she didn't need to go so far, but Focolor states that she does not trust humans. Focolor declares that she must judge Norman's worthiness with her own eyes, believing that humans lie even to themselves. Orobas tells her to stay out of it until the final trial is complete. He asks if she understands. As she walks away, Focolor quietly expresses her hope that Norman meets her expectations. She sees him as the potential vessel for the demon lord, who will one day lead them. Norman struggles with the hard labor, finding digging much more difficult than he anticipated, while Orobas checks on him. Their second request is to help with material collection at a large mine. Focolor explains that while the mine is rich with minerals and fossils, its expanding operations have led to chronic labor shortages, necessitating their help. Norman asks Orobas to break a large rock for him. With a single powerful strike, the demon shatters it. Inside, Norman finds a beautiful rainbow crystal, amazed to see one in person. He's confused when Orobas explains that the workers toss all mine materials into the carts, piling rare minerals up like junk. As he examines the pile, he spots something else. He pulls out a large, crystallized object, wondering if it's a claw or fang fossil, as Orobas notes its beauty. Norman excitedly speculates that it could be from an extinct magical beast. He thinks it could be valuable research material and plans to ask the workers about it later. Suddenly, Orobas senses that something is amiss. A low rumbling sound echoes through the mine, growing steadily louder. Their concern turns to shock as a torrent of water rushes towards them. A flash flood has suddenly inundated the mine. As the water surges, Orobas spots a trapped miner. The man cries desperately for help. Norman immediately wades through the current to rescue him. After pulling the man to safety, Norman asks what happened. The miner explains that a sudden storm on the surface caused the rainwater to flood the mines. Focolor watches the unfolding chaos with a detached expression. Norman asks about the other workers, and the miner explains he was swept away while trying to warn everyone. He tells them there's an emergency exit on the other side of the tunnel they can use to escape. The miner leads them up an emergency exit ladder. They emerge into a torrential downpour. The miner believes they are safe for now. He warns everyone to be careful of the wind and the river-like rainwater. His relief is short-lived, however, as he spots something horrifying and cries for help. He sees his fellow workers being swept away by the raging flood, shocked that they didn't make it out in time. Without a second thought, he rushes towards them, vowing to help. Norman tries to stop him, yelling that it's too dangerous to go alone. But the man slips on the slick rock and falls toward the torrent. Norman manages to grab him just in time, pulling him back from the edge. Desperate, Orobas furiously yells at Focolor to stop the storm, insisting there is no reason to take things this far. Norman, kneeling in exhaustion, asks Focolor if even she is powerless against this. Focolor admits to herself that if this continues, people will die, which goes against her ideals. She tells Norman that unfortunately, this is as far as she will go. A grim look of resolve crosses Norman's face. He whispers the name of another demon, Crosel. Orobas realizes with alarm that his master is planning to summon 3 demons at once. Norman insists there is no other way and asks Focolor for a little more time. She reluctantly agrees. Norman prepares to begin the summoning. Orobas is stunned to see him attempting a summoning without a magic circle. Norman begins his chant, calling forth a being from the endless beyond. He commands the demon to appear in his name. In a flash of light, Crocel emerges, marking the success of a three-demon simultaneous summoning. The effort of the summoning causes Norman to collapse, and Crocel rushes to his side. Focalar acknowledges her presence. Crocel greets Focalar, noting that it has been a while. Orobas and Crocel check on Norman, who assures them he's just drained from the mana consumption. He immediately asks Crocel to stop the flood and rain. She regretfully informs him that she can't. She explains that with his current power, he can only maintain her in this world for a few minutes. Using her magic would drain his mana completely before she could finish. As Orobas despairs at the news, Norman clenches his fist, declaring that there is still a way. Norman reveals his plan to use Spirit Descent, an ability that lets him take in a portion of a demon's power. He believes that if he pushes his spirit to its limit, he can wield nearly all of Crocel's water magic. Orobas protests that the strain will be unimaginable, but Norman insists he remembers how it felt. He is resolute, stating that he knows he can control it. Norman asks Crocel if she is ready. She agrees to cooperate with his wish. He begins a new chant, calling for beings beyond this world to offer their power. He asks them to dwell within his body, filling him with their knowledge and strength. He calls forth Crocel. The strain of the ritual is immense, causing Norman's nose to bleed. Orobas cries out in concern, but Norman insists he's fine. Internally, he focuses, remembering the feeling from the last time. He tells himself not just to take the power, but to accept it fully. A brilliant light envelops Norman as the spirit descent succeeds. Orobas and Focalar watch in awe as he transforms. Norman, his body now hosting Crocel's spirit, confirms he can hear her and says they must act quickly to save everyone. He instructs Orobas to rescue the other workers while he controls the vortex of water. Guided by Crocel's voice in his mind, Norman focuses on absorbing all the rainwater into one place. The miners watch in disbelief. The raging floodwaters around them begin to gather, pulled by an unseen force. The water gathers into a massive, dark sphere hovering in the sky. With the vortex contained, Norman gives Orobas the signal to begin the rescue. Norman marvels at his ability to control the water, and Crocel instructs him to disperse it. With a final push, Norman unleashes the power. The water sphere explodes and the storm vanishes. Orobas, having helped the miners, remarks that an evacuation wasn't needed after all. The spirit descent ends, and Norman collapses, exhausted but successful. Crocel's spirit expresses her concern for him before returning to the demon realm. He releases the spirit descent. Orobas turns to Focalar and asks if she is finally satisfied. Crocel's fading spirit warns Focalar not to test Norman again. Focalar approaches the weary Norman and tells him that he passes. She praises his astounding growth, noting his successful three-demon summoning and his strong will to save others. Norman explains his belief that true strength is used for others and that he is willing to sacrifice himself in the face of injustice. Acknowledging his inexperience but accepting his worth, Focalar declares that he passes. She kneels and formally bestows upon him her wind magic. She finally recognizes him as her master. Focalar calls out to her master. Orobas returns with a ladder, announcing that all the workers are safe. The miners thank Norman for saving them, and he expresses his relief that everyone is okay. Watching him, Focalar remarks that he has splendidly met their expectations. As Norman walks with the rescued miners, Focalar muses that if his pure heart ever falls to darkness, he will become the catalyst for a rebellion against God. She looks forward to seeing where his path will take him. She senses that someone else is also eagerly awaiting that moment. Elsewhere, a mysterious figure named Furkes looks out over a dark landscape. He contemplates his next move. He notes that with another trial complete, only Asmodeus and Bua remain. Deep within a cavern, the demon Furkes approaches his old comrade, Argars. Argars greets Furkes, surprised to see him so far from his usual domain. Furkes explains that the time for their long-awaited wish to be fulfilled may be near, and he wants Argars to lend his strength to the cause. Intrigued by this proclamation, Argars agrees to listen. Furkes explains that the current holder of the Ars Gosha is a boy named Norman who possesses the conviction and determination to defy his fate. He recounts how Norman, desperate to learn elemental magic, followed his advice to summon the demons of fire and water. Argaz is surprised to hear that Norman succeeded in taming both demons, something he has never heard of before. Furkers adds that even Focolor acknowledged the boy, and now that Norman seeks earth magic, he suspects Argaz will be summoned next. Furkers expresses his belief that Norman may be the very vessel who will lead them forward and asks Argaz to help the boy. Convinced by Furkers' passionate plea, Argaz agrees that the boy must be worth the trouble. For the sake of their shared, long-cherished wish, Argaz declares that he will cooperate. Back at his home, Norman successfully summons the powerful demon. The being introduces himself as Argaz, one of Solomon's 72 pillars, ranked second, and confirms that Norman seeks to learn earth magic. Norman is startled that Argaz already knows his name and purpose. The demon explains that Furkers told him everything. Orobas remarks that Norman seems to be quite highly regarded, a fact that surprises the young summoner. Argaz then states a condition must be met before he will teach Norman earth magic. He demands that Norman grant the wish of his comrade, Vasego, rank 3. Fulfill that wish, Argaz promises, and earth magic will be his. Norman formally greets the tall, silent demon Vasego. He finds Vasego's emotionless voice unsettling as he explains that Argaz sent him to help fulfill the demon's wish. Norman asks if their adjacent ranks signify a close relationship, but Vasego clarifies that rank only indicates the order they were sealed, not their bond. Vasego leads Norman to the home of the last surviving member of the Helvian family, a noble house that fell a century ago. As they approach the door, a voice from inside says they have been expected. A young maid greets them, addressing them as Lord Vasego and Summoner, and invites them to enter. As they walk inside, Norman questions if the person Vasego made a contract with over 100 years ago could really still be here. Vasego confirms it, explaining that the maid is a familiar he left behind a century ago. He then reveals his wish to take the life of the human who resides in the house, a moment he has long awaited. Hearing the true nature of the wish, Norman feels deeply conflicted. The familiar leads Norman and Vasego to a bedroom. She introduces the woman in the bed as Magnolia Helvian, the 125-year-old last descendant of her family. The young-looking woman welcomes Norman, expressing her pleasure at meeting him. Norman is shocked to learn she is 125 years old. He can't believe it as she looks so incredibly young. Vasego tells Magnolia that the time has come. Magnolia thanks Norman for summoning Vasego. She says that now they can finally fulfill their contract. Norman asks if she truly wants Vasego to take her life. She confirms that was the contract, her life in exchange for her wish. Norman admits he doesn't want to take Magnolia's life, even though he had his own wish for summoning the demons. Magnolia calls him kind but tells him not to feel guilty, as this is her contract. Seeing his hesitation, Norman asks if she would at least tell him her story. Magnolia agrees, stating that as the summoner, he has a right to know. Magnolia begins her story, recounting a time in her teens when she snuck out to escape her noble life. She quickly became lost and worried about what to do. A snapping twig startled her, causing her to cry out in fear. Just then, a young man with a horse appeared, asking if she was all right. He introduced himself as Rani and asked if she was lost. Rani, an orphan from the slums, showed her a different way of life, teaching her games and shortcuts to the river. For Magnolia, who was born into a life of titles and power, his world felt so alive, and she was drawn to his sincere nature. Before long, she found herself sneaking out regularly just to see him. She believed he must have started to suspect she was a noble from the way she dressed and behaved. One day, their peaceful time together was interrupted by an urgent cry for help. A young boy ran up, shouting that old man Emilio had been seriously hurt. They found Emilio on the ground, bleeding heavily from his leg after his axe broke while splitting firewood. Rani noted the wound was too deep and worried they couldn't get him to the doctor in the next town. As Rani prepared to ride for help, Magnolia told him to wait. Magnolia stepped forward, telling Rani to let her try. She asked everyone to keep what they were about to witness a secret. She placed her hands over the wound and began to concentrate. A glowing magic circle appeared, stunning the onlookers as she prepared to use her healing magic. In an instant, the deep wound completely vanished. The old man was amazed that not even a scar remained, and the others realized she could use magic. Rani gratefully thanked Magnolia for saving the old man. He told her he was really glad she was there, and she shyly agreed. Later, as they walked together, Rani admitted he knew she could use magic. He told her he'd figured she was a noble but kept quiet about it. He teased her that her secret visits were because she was sneaking out, not because it was unsafe for her to be alone. He then grew serious, noting that every time they had to part ways, she always made a sad little face. Ronnie told her she could come visit him in town whenever she liked. Magnolia wondered aloud what would happen if she could no longer see him. She worried about getting caught and punished by her family, never to be allowed outside again. Ronnie calmly asked her what she would do if that happened. She declared that she would break out. Ronnie smiled, saying that's exactly what he expected her to say. Magnolia admitted that if she did, she would likely be disowned by her family. Ronnie smiled warmly and told her that if she were ever disowned, she could come live with him. Magnolia was stunned into silence by his offer. She asked if he was proposing, which left Ronnie completely flustered. As he stammered, she teasingly confirmed that it was, in fact, a proposal. Upon returning to her family's estate, Magnolia was startled. Her sister called out her name, having caught her. Her sister confronted her, asking if she had been sneaking out again. She warned that their father was already suspicious and that getting caught would lead to severe consequences. Her sister then informed her that their father wished to speak with her. Resigned, she told Magnolia to come with her. Magnolia's sister brought her before their parents. Her mother cheerfully announced that she had wonderful news for Magnolia. Her father then revealed the news: they had decided on her fiancé. Magnolia protested, saying that at only 14 years old it was too early for an engagement. Her father dismissed her concerns, stating that while the marriage wouldn't be until she was 15, arranging it now was fine. They revealed her fiancé was the son of a noble family from a neighboring country, a man who had already lost 4 wives and was seeking a young girl to bear him heirs. Her mother asked her if the news wasn't wonderful, but Magnolia's expression was grim. Her mother pressured her to accept the proposal for the prosperity of their family, assuring her it was a fine match. Magnolia realized with dread that her own feelings were being completely ignored. She was expected to marry another noble simply because that's how it had always been done. As her family decided her fate, she asked herself what she truly wanted. Without hesitation, Magnolia rode her horse as fast as she could. She found Ronnie, who was surprised to see her again. She explained that she had gone home, but something had happened. She told him that her father had picked a fiancé for her. Ronnie looked downcast, assuming she had come just to say goodbye. But Magnolia cheerfully announced that she had refused the engagement, leaving him utterly shocked. Magnolia told him she refused because she had already chosen someone else. She explained that her family threatened to disown her, but she said that was fine and ran off. Ronnie worried about the danger they might be in, but Magnolia promised to heal him if anything happened. Overcome with emotion, Ronnie declared his happiness. He thanked her for choosing him and promised to treasure her forever as they embraced. Magnolia recounts how she lived a joyful life with Ronnie, using her healing magic as a town medic and eventually marrying him at 15. But she somberly adds that their happiness came to an end after only a few years. Norman recalls the history he knows about the fall of the Helvian family. He remembers the story of how they hoarded food during a famine, leading the enraged townsfolk to revolt and wipe out their entire bloodline. Magnolia recounts the horror of watching her own sister beheaded during the revolt. Because she had already been disowned and was a trusted town healer, her life was spared. In exchange for her life, she gave up her arms, the source of her magic. Norman is horrified, but Magnolia explains that she understood the townspeople's hatred and fear. She says that everyone had reached their limit from the sorrow of starvation and loss, and she was willing to sacrifice her arms if it could ease their pain, though Ronnie fought for her until the end. In a flashback, Ronnie pleads with the townsfolk, insisting Magnolia had nothing to do with her family's actions. A grieving woman asks if he can guarantee Magnolia won't seek revenge. She tearfully reminds him that her own child, only 3 years old, died. She screams that this is the only way to settle the grief for everyone who died. Ronnie remembers that Magnolia was the one who delivered that very child. A townsman gives the order to hold her down. Ronnie screams that Magnolia did nothing wrong, begging them to stop. Held down and gagged, Magnolia also pleads with them. Ronnie lets out a desperate scream. But his cries are ignored as the axe falls. Afterward, with her arms bandaged, Magnolia stands by her bed. A devastated Ronnie collapses, apologizing over and over for failing to protect her. Magnolia tries to comfort him, insisting it wasn't his fault and that the townspeople have been kind. But Rani is lost in his own grief. He blames himself, repeating that it was someone like him who brought this upon her. He weeps that if she hadn't chosen him, and if he hadn't told her to live with him, she would have been safe. Magnolia begs him to stop blaming himself. She tells him that all she ever wanted was to be with him. But from that day forward, none of her words could reach his guilt-ridden heart. After that day, Rani fell into a deep depression, constantly blaming himself. He avoided people and barely ate. The carefree smile he wore when they first met was gone. Then, one quiet night, Magnolia was awoken by a sudden noise. She got up to see what was wrong. She found that Rani, consumed by his guilt, had hung himself. Without her arms, she was powerless to even lift his body down, able only to cry out in horror. She screamed, regretting the loss of her arms more than ever before. Luckily, a neighbor heard her cries and rushed in. Soon, others arrived to help take him down. Thanks to their help, Rani barely survived. Watching over him, Magnolia wept, apologizing for being unable to ease his suffering. She vowed to make sure he would never have to be sad again, and resolved to end his pain. She decided there was only one way to save him from his pain. She had to erase every memory he had of her. She recalled a secret demon summoning ritual passed down through the Helvian family. Using the ritual, she successfully summoned the demon Vasego. Vasego noted that summoning a demon without a grimoire was no small feat. He remarked that her desire must be considerable. She told him her wish, to erase every memory Rani had of her. She offered her life as the price for the contract. However, she asked him to wait a little while before taking it. Her reason was that she wanted to see Rani off first. Vasego called her naive, but agreed to defer the payment until the next time he was summoned. The terms were harsh. Until then she could not leave the house, age, eat, sleep, or interact with anyone. He asked if she still wished for this, even if it meant being trapped in a cage of endless waiting. She agreed without hesitation. And so the contract was sealed. With his memories erased, Rani recovered, and Magnolia told him he was looking much better. He explained that he couldn't take the pain anymore and had wanted to die, but now he was okay. Magnolia then asked for a favor. She told him of a man who crafts prosthetic limbs beyond the mountains to the east. She lied, saying the man had made some for her, and asked if Rani would go pick them up. He readily agreed. Rani was shocked by the large amount of money she gave him. She lied, saying it was savings from her time as a healer, and told him not to lose it. She also gave him a memo with directions to ensure he wouldn't get lost. He promised to be back soon, and she wished him well. As he waved goodbye, he asked her why she had lied. Magnolia explains to Vasego that she knew Rani needed to leave the town to escape his past, and thought he would go if he believed it was for her. Since she no longer needed food, money, or to age, she gave it all to Rani so he could start a new life. Vasego admits he doesn't understand, as humans typically desire wealth, fame, and power. She replies that she doesn't care about any of that. If Rani can live in peace, she doesn't even care if it costs her own life. Magnolia tells Vasego that humans have a word for this feeling: love. Vasego calls her a foolish woman for sacrificing her life for someone who will now forget her completely. With tears in her eyes, she bids a final, silent goodbye to Rani. Her last thought is a declaration of her love for him. As Rani walks towards the town, he feels he is almost there. But suddenly, his memory of his purpose flickers and fades. He stops confused, wondering why he is even there. He tries to remember his purpose, but can't. He searches his bag for a clue. He finds clothes, food, and a large amount of money, but no answers. Then he discovers a small note. Reading the clumsy handwriting, he wonders if he wrote it to himself. The note explains that he has been traveling for a long time, losing his memory, and that his final destination is the town past the mountains. It says the note was written to remind him that his journey is over and he can now rest. He accepts this explanation. Though he still can't remember the details, he feels the weight of a long journey coming to an end. Finishing her story, Magnolia explains that for 100 years all she did was pray for Rani's happiness. Now that Vasego has been summoned, her long wait is over and the contract can finally end. She asks Vasego one last thing before he takes her: did Rani find happiness? Vasego replies that he doesn't know if he was happy, but he can tell her how he lived. Vasego reveals that Rani passed away peacefully, surrounded by his family and friends. Hearing this, Magnolia is overcome with relief. With tears of joy, she says she is truly glad. She sincerely thanks Vasego for telling her. Magnolia tells Vasego that to her, he has always been a savior. With no regrets left, she asks him to take her. As Vasego's hand reaches for her, Norman cries out for them to wait. He protests that she has lived all this time holding on to a memory, only to pay the price now. He calls her fate too cruel. Magnolia, touched, asks if he is crying for her, and says that knowing her love found happiness is her greatest joy. Magnolia tells Norman that what people call happiness and misfortune are subjective and that someday he will understand. Vasego then addresses Norman directly. He says that he has watched over humans for a very long time. And in all that time, he has come to realize something important about them. Vasego muses that humans are foolish, tragic, and yet so very precious. As Magnolia peacefully fades in his arms, he states that he will now take her to the underworld. He explains that there, she will relive her happiest days with Ronnie in an endless, peaceful dream. This eternal dream, Vasego explains, is his mercy. A tearful Norman thanks him for granting his wish and promises to tell Argaz everything. Vasego announces he is taking her and leaving now. The familiar reappears, promising Norman that Vasego will gladly lend his power again if ever needed. Alone, Norman reflects on the words he has heard about himself. He stares into the empty room, contemplating his supposed destiny as the vessel for the Demon King. Having fulfilled the condition, Norman begins his training, unleashing a powerful earth magic spell. Massive spikes of rock erupt from the ground at his command. Orobas watches in amazement, praising his master for mastering the element so quickly. Argaz tells Norman that with his level of control, he has the basics down and just needs more training. Norman is pleased, believing that with all 4 elemental magics learned, he can now compete in the tournament. Argaz commends his impressive focus and ability to learn so quickly. Norman reflects that his initial goal was simple, but the experience became much more profound. Argaz reminds Norman that, wish or not, he still played a part in taking Magnolia's life. Norman admits that even now, he doesn't fully understand what Magnolia meant. He explains that he threw himself into mastering earth magic, so her sacrifice would not be in vain. Argaz suggests that he is simply getting used to demonic magic, but Norman disagrees. Argaz corrects his own statement, looking at Norman intently. Argaz explains that Norman is getting used to wielding demonic power itself, proof that he is growing into a true commander of demons. Norman reveals that something has been on his mind for a while. He believes Vasego's words about humanity are connected to Furka's belief that he is meant to command all demons. Norman looks at Argaz seriously and asks him to tell him the truth. He places a hand on his chest and asks what the vessel of the Demon King really is. Argaz speaks gravely about the vessel of the Demon King. He confirms to a silent Norman that this title refers directly to him. Argaz assures Norman that he is safe from harm, though the complete truth about the vessel remains hidden for now. He states with certainty that everything will be made clear in due time. Norman internally questions Furka's intentions, noting the lack of hostility from any of the demons he's met. Orobas arrives, asking if Norman is finished with his training for the day. Norman agrees to stop training for the day and go shopping with Orobas. He thinks about the final guild request he must complete, a search for a person. Argaz calls out to Orobas. He delivers a message, demanding to know how long Orobas plans to stay away. Orobas states that his loyalty is now to Norman, not his former master. Argaz simply acknowledges his response. Suddenly, a voice calls out for Norman from the nearby house. Crossel rushes out and embraces him, overjoyed to see him again. Norman explains that he needs her help with a quest involving a magic beast. Norman explains that his last guild quest turned out to be a search for a magic beast, not a person. The only information they have is the beast's name, Lucky, and a crude drawing. He turns to Crossel, hoping she might have some ideas on how to find it. Crossel suggests summoning her friend Valak, who she says is an expert at finding things. Orobas is reassured by Crossel's confidence in her friend. Norman is hesitant to summon another demon, but decides to trust Crossel's recommendation. He agrees to try summoning her. Norman begins the incantation to summon the demon. Orobas and Crossel are impressed that he can now summon 3 demons at once, without a magic circle. In a blinding light, Norman calls forth the 62nd demon, Valak. The newly summoned demon, Valak, appears and joyfully calls out to Crossel. The 2 friends embrace warmly. Valak then turns to Norman, readily offering her assistance, explaining that Furka's already told her to cooperate. Norman realizes with surprise that Furkas has been speaking to other demons about him. Valak enthusiastically agrees to help with the magic beast search. Norman is surprised she'd agree so easily, even with Krosel's recommendation. Valak says her only condition is that she and Norman become friends. As Norman agrees and they shake hands, he cries out in pain. Valak apologizes, having misjudged her own strength. Krosel gently scolds her friend for not being more careful. Valak carries Norman through the air, and he assures her it's fine. He insists that flying is much faster than taking a carriage. However, Valak points out that Krosel and Orobas look incredibly unhappy about the arrangement. Krosel and Orobas argue over who should have the honor of carrying Norman. Valak tells Norman she's glad Krosel is doing better, thanking him for his help. Norman thinks to himself that Valak was the one who was always there for Krosel. Valak spots a crater below that looks like a good place to land. Sensing the magic beast is close, she tells Krosel and Orobas to scout ahead while she lets Norman rest. After they land, Norman asks Valak what she meant by rest, as she points to a pack of beasts. Valak confirms their target is among the creatures, and Norman is amazed she found it so quickly. Eager to finish the quest, Norman starts to run towards them. However, Valak grabs his cloak, stopping him in his tracks. As Norman falls, Valak taunts him, asking if he really thought she would follow his orders. Her expression turns menacing as she calls him a dumbass. Valak recalls following Krosel after she fell from grace, unable to leave her friend alone in her sorrow. But after Norman summoned Krosel, she recovered almost instantly. Valak declares that she won't let someone like Norman have Krosel. She laments that she wanted to be the one to save her friend. Norman lands unharmed, but he and Valak are both shocked by what they see. A massive dragon has appeared, and Orobas and Krosel cry out in alarm from above. The dragon grabs Orobas and Krosel, who struggle in its grasp. Krosel desperately tries to offer Norman as a meal to save themselves. Nearby, Norman spots a nest full of large eggs. He and Valak realize they have intruded on the dragon's nest. The enraged dragon prepares to attack. Norman quickly casts a water blade spell. The spell explodes against the dragon, forcing it to release its captives. As they plummet, Norman grabs onto Krosel's leg for dear life. Krosel yells at him to let go, but Norman refuses, not wanting to die. The furious dragon dives after them. Krosel screams Norman's name as they fall. Norman calls out for Orobas and Krosel as he hangs on. Orobas swoops in, grabbing them and tossing them to safety. He then launches himself at the dragon with a powerful kick. After Orobas' attack, Krosel calls out to Valak. With a stern expression, she orders Valak to get Norman back to the ground. Once they are safe, Norman asks what just happened, recalling he heard talk of him being food. Valak tries to play it off as a simple prank. Krosel furiously explains that Norman is like a god to her, and that she only meant to scare him. She demands that Valak apologize properly. Valak mutters resentfully about how everything is always about Norman. Valak insists she didn't do anything wrong. Coldly, Krosel tells Valak she is cutting ties with her. The threat hits Valak hard, leaving her stunned. Krosel confirms she means it for all of eternity. Overwhelmed, Valak begins to cry, finally apologizing for her actions. Valak cries that she was just so mad that Norman came out of nowhere and took Krosel away. She complains that even after Krosel returned, all she talked about was Norman, making a flustered Krosel try to silence her. Norman gently asks if she just wanted to play a little prank. Valak bows her head in apology. Norman tells Valak that he understands she cares deeply for Krosel too. He suggests that she felt her own feelings were being ignored, leading to her jealousy. While Krosel is still worried, Norman reassures her that there's nothing to worry about. Valak apologizes sincerely, promising she's learned her lesson. Krosel also apologizes for threatening to cut ties with her. The two friends call out to each other, their bond restored. With everyone reconciled, Norman tells them it's time to catch the magic beast and find the missing Orobas. The team works together to corner the magic beast. They successfully capture their target. Back at the guild, the receptionist congratulates them on a job well done. She confirms the quest is complete. The guild will now take care of returning the creature, Lucky, to its owner. Krosel greets Norman, surprised he's finished so quickly. Orobas confirms that his master has now successfully completed 3 guild missions. Norman realizes he has now fulfilled the principal's requirement. His focus is now set on the Magic Tournament finals. A young man named Art knocks on a door, checking to see if his friend Regal is still alive inside. He enters, noting that Regal finished his own guild quests quickly and has been shut in ever since. He finds Regal slumped over a desk piled high with books, who announces that he's finally done. Art picks up a sheet of paper, looking at it in disbelief. Regal proudly declares it his second unique magic formula. Art is shocked, asking how Regal created a second unique magic formula in such a short time. He muses that such a feat should take years to accomplish. Regal confidently calls himself a genius and tells Art to prepare for training tomorrow. Art sighs, expressing that he feels bad for Norman. At a large estate, someone learns that Norman is entering the magic tournament. Norman's brother, Dimitri, scoffs at the news, dismissing his brother as a failure. He knows the winner gets a recommendation to Xenoc's Magic Academy, a school for only the most talented. Dimitri assumes Norman thinks getting in will convince their father to revoke his exile. Dimitri bursts into his father's study. His father, busy with work, chides him for not knocking, but Dimitri says it's urgent. With a confident smile, Dimitri says he needs to ask for a favor.